Good to see you guys here. Git, hi there from Sweden. Corina from Austria, not Australia. Good to see you. Corina from Ireland. Big Lock Joker, good to see you. Elin Dörfler says, where in Sweden? Where are you? Stephanie, thanks for joining us. I know I think you were trying to rush to make the live, but anyway, it wasn't as early as I thought it would be. Just a lot is happening in the Cleo Smith case, just trying to stay informed about that. But I think Australia is going to sleep now, so that gives us a chance to catch up with other things. I'm going to ask you guys how many of you want to hear about the Cleo Smith case a little bit later on. I do want to start off with Gabby Petito. I've kind of got a program here. We're going to go through 7 aspects. We're going to deal with, the first question I want to ask is, how did the cadaver dogs miss Brian when they were apparently within almost a quarter of a mile from his remains, about 2,000 feet? Then we're going to deal with the Mary Piglets incident and something that just changes the whole thing, a scenario that potentially changes the whole thing. I'm also going to talk about something that I haven't seen very much. If you guys watched my previous video on this, we dealt with Depop, the e-commerce site that Gabby used that a lot of people didn't know about. Well, I want to talk about Yelp and the Mary Piglets, something that I thought was going to be a game changer in a way. It was going to sort of show us exactly what is going on. So I'm going to talk about that. That's the second point. Then I want to share with you I've actually taken some photographs out of my album back in the day when you took photos with film, printed them out, and put them in photo albums, not like it is today. So I'm going to be taking you through just a little snippet of, it wasn't a van life experience for me, but it was something similar. When I was in the UK, I'm just going to show you some photos. And what I want to do through that is just once again connect with the feeling that Brian and Gabby probably had when they were traveling together. Then we're going to deal with your best questions. This time I did make sure, I actually sent them to myself twice, but I will obviously be taking your questions and your super chats and all that kind of thing. And then we're going to go to Ernest Becker. I found quite an interesting thing that he said about silence. And bear in mind, people describe Brian Laundrie as quiet. And so I want to interpret Brian Laundrie through this idea of silence and what is it probably like traveling with him. And then the sixth thing is critical thinking. I want to talk about something dealing with critical thinking that just shows us how widespread it is that people don't think critically. And then the 7th thing I'm actually going to open with, I'm going to start with this. It's something to do with my garden and my home, and it just gives us an idea of how we think about things. I'm using myself as an example. Let me just continue greeting you guys. Sharon Tuck, thank you for making it. Hedy Hilton, hi from California. Big Lock Joker says he knew the relationship was over. Victoria Petrovich Hola, hi there. She calls me Rockets. Just popping in to say hi and show my support. Okay, well, I hope you sleep well. This is quite late for the folks in the UK. It's heading towards midnight there, as it is here. Mary O'Connor, Mary from Minnesota, hi. Lou D says, hi, Nick, how is South Africa? South Africa's just had our elections, and elections are quite a good example of where you try and use what you know to predict something that is uncertain. and sometimes what you know does repeat itself. So what you know is a sort of stereotype and is a cliche and is a pattern that informs what happens. And I would say that the elections that have just happened here did kind of conform to that. It was sort of, with a small little changes, it was pretty much the same thing repeated again. And sometimes you think that it's going to repeat and it's completely different. Alicat says, rockets, I love it. Bria, good to see you. Batman, I see, is also here. Angela Bierman, hi from Iowa. You probably say Bierman. Heather K, it's 9:40 in the UK, really, 9:40. So you must have gone back in your daylight savings, right? I imagine. Barbara Hall, hi from Covington, Tennessee. Just with Tennessee in mind and Summer Wells, someone made quite an interesting comment that I saw somewhere where they were saying Cleo Smith is an unusual case, and we've actually heard the McCanns coming forward and saying they're so happy about the outcome, and they obviously want to be associated with the Cleo Smith case, where the parents are ostensibly innocent and not connected to any of the events, right? And then there's an abductor, and then the child is returned safely at the end of a certain period of time. And this is exactly what happened with Madeleine McCann. And the thing, though, that I think one's got to ask is, why did the McCanns not say anything when Summer Wells disappeared? You know, it's been about 140 days now. They haven't said anything about that case. So why not? I mean, it's been a huge case in America. Why wouldn't the McCanns show their support there? What do you guys think? Greetings from Poland. Catherine Hargrave from California. Catherine, thanks a lot for your assistance with, getting information, that sort of thing. Belinda Tafe, hi from Australia. Belinda, you're up fairly late. Tammy Anderson, hi from South Carolina. Was that South Carolina? North Carolina. I love to hear your thoughts about all these cases. Okay. Someone said she did comment. I'm not sure what you're referring to. Okay, yeah, please put the link there. I'd be interested to see what they say. Michelle Atkinson, hi from Durham, England. Jedi Bunny says, I've been quietly lurking for a while and very much appreciate the humanistic lens to which you see. Okay, so I'm just going to start off with an analogy for, there were some people who said, wow, you usually spot on, but you're completely wrong in the Cleo Smith case. And I want to give you an example of where I was completely wrong in my own garden. And so this morning, but I want to set the stage to see what you guys think. This morning, the dog and cat were sort of standing at the window, very alert, very excited, almost turning somersaults that they wanted to go out into the garden so badly. And I'd shortly before that put out bird seed. And so there's like some pretty big rock pigeons and some other birds that were doing their thing. And there are some small little lizards, but there's quite a lot of life in my garden. I don't poison or I don't put insecticide out or anything. But anyway, both the dog and the cat were really, really alert and really wanting to go out. And but I couldn't see what they're looking at. And I had my assumptions, but I just want to know what you guys think may have caught the dog and the cat's attention in such a big way. What do you think it was? I suppose you guys don't really have that much context. I live in a complex and there are a certain amount of cats, feral and otherwise. There are also some dogs now in the complex. But what do you think it was? So a couple of you have said the birds, okay? So anyway, let me cut to the chase. when I opened the door, both animals stormed out, and this large winged creature, its wings, both wings were probably longer than my arm, outstretched. Not sure if I would say, wouldn't make both arms, but it was certainly, probably if I'd stretch out my arm, both its wings outstretched would be longer than my arm, right? So it was a very big bird. And I don't think it's the first time I'd ever seen it in the garden, but I haven't seen them very often. But what I realized when I saw this bird, it's known as a ibis, the hardy-dar ibis. You can, shall I type it in if you wanna Google it? Just type it in here. If you wanna have a look at it. But anyway, it's got a really long beak. Its beak's about this long and sort of curved, and then it suddenly made sense. The deep gouge marks that I was finding all over my garden, like these deep sort of little holes kind of in pot plants and all sorts of things. And to be honest, in my mind, I thought that was an olive thrush, which is a bird about 10% the size of the ibis, with a orange beak, right? And those birds eat the same things generally as the ibis, right? So that was kind of what I had in my mind, and it turned out to be totally unexpected, totally surprising. But if I'd been paying attention, I would have noticed big white splodges on the paving. And what was making that was this big bird. Seagulls also sort of make that sort of thing. So what I'm trying to say is, when you have a kind of a bias, when you're sort of not clearing your mind completely and curious and taking in information, you may be inclined to see what you want to see. And so when I saw these gouge marks by the pot plants, I thought that was probably made by a very aggressive olive thrush, which is a much smaller bird. And now it makes complete sense, because those gouge marks exactly fitted the big curved bill of this ibis. And so I'm just saying, I was really surprised by this bird launching out of the garden, and the cat as well almost did a backward flip, because this bird is about 3 times bigger than a chicken. And of course, when the bird just flew up onto the roof, and then from there cried out, and the cat's eyes stretched like this, and it was like cowering. So yeah. So I'm just saying a simple example of how cognitive bias informs what you don't see, and you don't always expect something like that. I mean, that is a bit of an exceptional thing. You don't normally get big birds like that in your garden. Something else that did prove to be true in terms of patterns, right, is I don't know if you guys remember when Brian Laundrie disappeared, I said maybe the way to look for him is to not look for him. And by that I kind of meant look for him through, I obviously assumed he was alive, look for him through communication, surreptitious communications, movements of money, also through his habitual behavior, which in a way is the answer to where he was. Where did he normally go? Find out. And of course, that wasn't something you would easily know, because his parents weren't really talking. Cassie was talking to the media, but not, I wouldn't say she was terribly forthcoming. And at one point, a reporter did ask, where did you guys summer? It was in that line of where would you habitually go? Where would you habitually go camping, kind of thing. And so I think I made this comparison in a previous live where I talked about this big spider, and I said, I don't need to look for the spider. The spider is going to reveal itself. And that turned out to be true. And the spider did reveal itself. The that when I opened that bird's nest and it was so close to my hand, I eventually found the spider about a day or two ago. I put a photo of that spider on Instagram. Stephanie's just put that over there, I think. And it was about a meter from my front door. And so the spider, I think, was trying to make its way back to me. And bear in mind, Brian Laundrie was quite close to his parents, so it wasn't as though he was running away or trying to get as far from where he was. He was actually trying to be as close to home as he could be without being home. In other words, he was trying to be, you could almost imagine that he was trying to maintain a kind of a contact with home, right? And I don't know whether the helicopter circling enhances anxiety. I don't know whether he had a burner phone and he was, looking at the news or something. I don't know if that had an impact. I have been thinking about, was he suicidal? Was he depressed? I'm talking about before, like before even the van life trip. And to me, they don't really go together. You don't go on something like the Summer Epic if you're depressed. You don't go on holiday. You don't go on an adventure. You don't go out into the world if you're a sort of depressed person. He may have been a bit cynical about the prospects of the van life journey, but so the question is, did he commit suicide? And and that brings us to this first question. Why did the cadaver dogs miss Brian? Why did they not smell him, right? So just follow me where I'm going with this. Would you or would anyone want to be in a relationship, let alone get married to someone who seemed depressed and down and suicidal? You wouldn't, right? So I think that is potentially important to take into the aftermath. I've also said, if Brian was involved in the crime against Gabby in Wyoming, why did he try and escape that situation? Potentially, if he was trying to set up alibis, why was he doing that? Why go to all the effort to go home only to take his life, right? So there does seem some intent to stay alive. I mean, also, why would he take the money, right? Now, I don't want to make the same mistake and say, everything is predictable and the criminal mind is logical, and what you're seeing out in the garden can only be one thing. Because I think it's certainly possible that a young person who is somewhat erratic in their moods and their frame of mind, who has episodes, they can go from being somewhat settled and somewhat positive to very unsettled. And so I don't want to negate that. So that's certainly a possibility that following what happened, Brian did have kind of an episode. He was alone, he needed support, he didn't get it, and he kind of went on a downward spiral or whatever. That's possible. But I think there's also another possibility. I think we've just got to be open-minded to this. And in a way, it may hold hands with this first question. How did the cadaver dogs miss Brian, right? So let me just have a look at some of your points here. S.M. Kovalinsky says, I believe he committed suicide. Things were getting worse with the van impounded. Yeah, I also do. I also think that is more than likely. But I'm just saying this to address other possibilities, which I think we need to bear in mind. The anthropologist report hasn't come out yet, so we don't know for certain. I don't know if we will ever know for certain. But just consider this. So it's quite important to consider a possibility in order to either exclude it or to keep it on the back burner or to later see supporting evidence for it. So, for example, if a gun is ever found, thanks, Batman, if a gun is ever found in the area or a bullet, that will be very corroborating evidence. I must say, if they don't find that, I'm going to be sort of believing that he probably committed suicide, but without evidence, which really, how meaningful is that? So consider this. The question is, how did cadaver dogs miss Brian? And the distance is around it's less than half a mile. It's almost a quarter mile. It's about 2,000 feet. And so you've kind of got to turn on your rocket burners in terms of your imagination. You've got to try and get all your senses activated, sight, smell, hearing, and whatever. And in terms of that, I think you've got to consider a scenario. The one scenario is Brian commits suicide, and whether it's by knife or overdose or gunshot or whatever, he's then lying out kind of in the open. Thanks, Bridget. Thanks for that. Angela Bierman, thanks a lot. Thanks for that. So if he was lying out there, then you would have a gradual movement of organisms, large and small, alligators, probably wild boar, frogs even, snakes, thanks E. Miller, vultures, I want to talk about that in a moment, other predatory birds, insects, and so on. You know, it's quite a grotesque thing to imagine, but that whole process, right? And so, no, but what I'm trying to say is, if he took his life and now he's lying down on the ground and there's this long period of decomposition, right? And you might argue and say, well, a week isn't very long. As long as it's a couple of hours, that's more than enough time for cadaverine to form, if you follow my reasoning. So you don't need weeks or even days. You just need one long period in terms of hours, right? So whether it's 24 hours or whatever, you're going to have a lot of this cadaverine, which is a very potent chemical. And even if you remove the body after that, that chemical is going to remain, right? And so if Brian was there for an extended period, right, you would imagine there would be almost an area that is sort of almost blackened with that oozy decomposition stuff, if I can put it that way, stuff that was seeped into the ground. Now, what makes this definitely more complicated is you have the addition of water. Now, could the water have washed it away, or should the water have washed that in a way that the dogs were actually closer to the source of it? Thanks a lot, Angela. I don't know if you're following my reasoning. In other words, does the water aggravate the situation or mitigate it? Does the water that is there bring the cadaver odor closer to the dogs, or does it dilute it, or is it kind of a mixture of both, right? I'm just looking at some of your comments. Okay, and so I want to just give you an alternative. So I do think that there is a little bit of a question: why did the cadaver dogs miss Brian? And I'm someone who kind of believes a cadaver dog, you really do need to, they need to cross over where the cadaver was. And I'm talking about when the actual site has been either cleaned or contaminated in some way or diluted. They need to actually go physically over that terrain in order to alert, if that makes sense. On the other hand, if the cadaver odor is strong enough and the dog is skilled enough, you can have some extraordinary things happen, such as apparently in the Scott Peterson case. I mean, I scarcely can believe this, is that the dogs actually could follow the scent on the road that Scott Peterson took to the marina. The dogs actually running through the neighborhood, actually smelling it almost in the air, if that makes sense. And there's a part of me that's like, I don't know if I believe that. It just seems like totally superhuman, super canine, right? In any event, even if you accept that, then you kind of got to imagine that cadaver odor should have been in the water, right? And the only way to know for certain is to know exactly the route that the cadaver dogs took. But we do know that they got within quite a short distance. S.M. Kowalinsky, thank you, says, I don't have the answer, but I did read several articles in which forensic experts said it made no sense that the cadaver dogs had missed Brian all those weeks. So thanks a lot for saying that, because now I want to address that question on its own terms, because I tend to agree with that. There could be other things at work. It could also be, I'm not quite sure if it's wetter or dog senses better. If it has rained, or dogs better, or is the scent more airborne, or is it worse? Because you tend to have that thing of, if scent dogs are after you, run through a stream, right? So I'm not quite sure about that, but this is the answer. This is what I think takes us a bit forward in that. And I want to apologize in advance for what I'm going to say, because it may be quite disturbing and unsettling. And this is where we come to also those vultures. Someone has got a channel, I think the channel, certainly the abbreviation for the channel is AM. It's quite a new channel. He does quite a lot of drone footage and so on. Timmy's down here. I don't know if do you want to see him? Timmy is there. Seems to be a bit tired today. So yeah, in terms of this particular guy who used this drone footage, he actually showed these vultures. I'm not quite sure exactly the kind of vultures that they are, but there were these huge vultures, maybe 10 of them, right at the entrance going over that bridge, right? And, it's a little bit like the big bird that I saw in my garden today. I found that quite unexpected, those birds. So this is what I want to present to you. I think it's possible that Brian may not have killed himself, but that he was actually killed by a wild animal. And what that could mean is that the moment that he's killed is also consumed, which would prevent cadaver odor from forming. Remember, you need an hour or 2 hours for that process to take place, right? So you could have a situation where Brian is ambulant or whatever, and then the next thing, a wild animal actually attacks him, and then immediately he's consumed by that predator, right? And an alligator is definitely a candidate here, definitely an important candidate. And so you would have a situation where the engine rooms, not a very appropriate way to express it, but the engine room for these chemicals is simply not allowed to initiate, because the body is consumed basically immediately, right? And not small parts of the body, large parts of it. And then whatever remains is then also consumed by the vultures. And so you have a scenario where the cadaver odor can't actually form, because the body is consumed quickly, and whatever is remained is sort of dispersed kind of in the water in a way, if that makes sense. I'm not saying that the whole body was consumed in like 10 minutes or an hour, but it could have been mostly consumed within something like 3 hours, especially if it starts off with an alligator, right? And so I'm saying that would explain, in other words, the body being consumed at the time of death, or very close to the time of death. That would explain no cadaver odor. Whereas with suicide, you would expect the body to lay prostrate, like on the ground or wherever, for quite a long period of time before the scavengers notice anything. And what scavengers tend to notice is smell. And so the body would probably produce some of these odors if someone had taken their own life and there was time for that smell to develop. So that's all I'm trying to say, is that the fact that the cadaver dogs didn't alert suggests that Brian didn't commit suicide. That's all I'm saying. There could be another explanation. And as I say, if we do find a gun and a bullet, then I think that would be that would sort of settle the matter. And also Brian's own notebook, I think, could provide information there. The other thing is, although we're taking our cue from certain information, it doesn't mean that what we're taking our cue, it doesn't mean that it translates perfectly. It simply means it's a cue, and we anchor what we know in a cue, and then we try and extrapolate from that, and we may extrapolate correctly or not. The fact is, we do know there were big predators there, not only alligators, but also wild boar and also the vultures. So the ability to sort of strip or the tissues quickly is definitely there. Someone says they didn't search there with the dogs, I heard. Well, they did search close to that area, and the question is, I mean, I guess one could also do an experiment. You could put a cadaver in the same distance for X period of time, and then you could walk by it, and would the dogs run in that direction, or wouldn't they? I think the other thing to bear in mind is how was Brian's remains ultimately discovered? I think it was discovered by a human being, not by a dog. I could be wrong. As far as I know, a person saw the bones. I don't know if anybody smelled anything, and I think that is also kind of an interesting clue. Someone says alligators, unlike crocodiles, are territorial, not predatory. I'm not that familiar with alligators. I know a fair bit about crocodiles because we get them here. I don't think we get alligators here. Stephanie says, I'm still surprised he was in the wilderness, not hiding out inside somewhere. I'm also surprised, and I think the fact that he was in the wilderness also, I think, evokes the suicide narrative, because, did he go into the wild with the intention of surviving for quite a long time? It doesn't look that way. Taking your notebook isn't really the best camping gear. The other thing that I think it would be interesting to find out is, where was Brian's camp? If he intended to stay there, where was his camp? Or was there a camp? Maybe he didn't intend to stay there. Maybe he intended to pass through, as in to literally arrive there, spend some time. I think there are picnic tables here and there, write down what he wanted to write down, and then kiss the world goodbye. I don't think the gun found by the fishermen were Brian's. I don't know, like the gun in Brian's bedroom has got the American flag sort of insignia on it, that sort of pattern. And so that gun didn't look anything like it. Yeah, that's possible, Pauline. It's possible. And Warcher says, fits the misunderstood artist theme. You can do research on suicide and you'll find, I think by far the most common form is gunshot wound. It's the quickest and it's the least painful. Some people don't have guns, would choose hanging, and that can't be a very pleasant way. I think also, I'm not quite sure which one is more, hanging or drug overdose, but someone says the gun in his bedroom was wood. Do you know that for sure? The gun in the water wasn't green or rusty. That's quite a good point. Yeah. But I mean, where was it? That gun wasn't in the park, right? It wasn't where you'd expect it to be. The American flag was the gun holder. I actually didn't know that. Okay. Yeah, Terry, that's also possible. It's also possible. Bria says, imagine they found only one tooth. When will we know? I don't think they only found one tooth, but one tooth might be sufficient. We'll probably know in the next 2 weeks or so. I did see that thing that Brian Enton did where he said, maybe we will never know, the FBI will never tell us. I kind of get the sense that law enforcement has been very forthcoming, and a lot of people are sympathetic and compassionate towards Gabby and her family, and I think there's no reason why the FBI would withhold that, as far as I'm concerned. I'm sure that they want to share with the American public so that it brings closure, right? I'm sure that they will be forthcoming and want to be forthcoming. There's not really a legal impediment to that, I don't think. Simone says, wonder where Gabby's belongings are, like her watch and phone and laptop, especially her phone, but yeah, laptop as well. Good question, Simone. Laurie's Bella says, but there's a picture of Gabby holding his gun. Yeah. Jason says, we all agree it's a fake gun. Well, if you want to make that argument that the gun's fake, then I think the possibility rises that Brian was attacked by a predator. I think that definitely rises. Because if you take that away, well, there was no rope, certainly not with a knot on it, the way you'd expect it to be. I suppose substances are possible, but I personally don't. It's not so easy to get hold of those substances if you in a family that doesn't use certain, like that aren't super medicated. And Brian, as far as we know, wasn't on anything. Like he wasn't taking any medication, so I don't know. So that brings us to the next thing, Mary Piglets. And someone actually posted something that definitely takes our thinking in a different direction. And in a way, to me, it's like the cadaver dogs thing. I personally believe Brian committed suicide. I personally believe that he used a gun. That seems to make sense, but it may also just be cognitive bias. Maybe it's something completely different. In terms of the Mary Piglets, I want to quote from something that is really interesting here. See if I can find it. I think this was posted on YouTube by Margaret Van Wanning, Terry Dean. Is it possible that the Mary Piglet server was rude or gave poor service to the point of causing unrest? Server would not have told the manager that. I think it is possible, but I don't think that is what happened. Anything could have happened. Could have been someone with an abrasive personality, or it was a busy time and all that kind of thing. Thanks, Jason. I was actually at a restaurant over the weekend, and I was trying to eat quickly because we were going to go and watch a movie, and the movie, it was like countdown to the movie. And when the server came to fetch the plates, the server spilled salad dressing down my leg and on my foot. So I was wearing flip-flops, and the server spilled the salad dressing that was on the plate, so that like my entire foot was just sort of salad dressing, and I only noticed a little bit later that it had also splodged onto my jean, right? So I noticed what had happened. I wasn't very happy with what happened. But I was sort of like, just what can you do? Just made, and I didn't even say anything. So someone else in that situation could explode. Someone could get really upset, and especially if you were already aggravated, if you already something had happened there and there and there, you could really. Let me put it this way: if I'd been living in a van and I was dirty already and tired of, or I'd just showered and someone had done that and I just washed my clothing that had been whatever, I would probably not have been so cordial. But I was in a fairly good mood, and although I wasn't happy, I kind of took it in my stride. But I'm just saying, a thing like that can set some people off. I don't know if Gabby is the kind of person who would be bothered by things like that. I somehow think that Brian might actually take more exception to that. So, but that's not the thing that I want to share with you. The thing I want to share with you is a quote that I think was, a comment that was put on YouTube by Margaret Van Wanning, and I'm just going to read it. She says, "I understand they ran Gabby's credit card and it declined. So again, they ran it and it went through. Gabby thought money was being taken out twice and wanted her money back, which when the same card is ran twice, the company catches it and doesn't take it out twice. It takes a couple of days for it to balance out. Gabby didn't understand this procedure. It's sort of complicated, but has happened to me. It does cause stress, exclamation mark." So when I read that, I thought that would make complete sense for everything that happened. I don't know what you guys think. Do you want me to read that again? Did you guys catch that? Stargirl says, "I think that Brian was more quiet than Gabby was." I agree with that. Okay, so I'm going to read this again. It's from Margaret Van Wanning's comment that she left. She said, "I understand they ran Gabby's credit card and it declined. And so again, they ran it and it went through. Gabby thought money was taken out twice and wanted her money back, which when the same card is run twice, the company catches it and it doesn't take it out twice. It takes a couple of days for it to balance out. Gabby didn't understand this procedure. It's sort of complicated, but this happened to me. It does cause stress." Now, that is a kind of a scenario where it's not the fault of the restaurant. It's not the fault of the server, meaning the waitress. It's not Gabby's fault. It's nobody's fault. It's kind of something that happens like a glitch, and it can be stressful because you just don't know what the situation is. You don't know that you've been charged twice, and you can't sort of solve the problem instantly. You can't like, okay, here's your money back or whatever. And so if you're in a situation where you have a budget and you don't have much money and you're trying to save, and you sort of, I want to take the risk, but you sort of go to a restaurant sort of thinking, well, we can't really afford this, but let's just treat ourselves, and then you end up almost being punished for that. You end up spending double. And as far as I know, the Mary Piglets is quite expensive. I could be wrong, but I did go to Yelp and I did see some people, and I guess it's relative. Some people might say it's expensive, others not. But the point is, Gabby was sensitive in terms of money, and I think they would have been. Right. And I think anyone in that situation, whether you financially in a good place or not, you're not going to want to be charged twice for a restaurant meal. Right. So you can almost imagine that Gabby is anxious, and Gabby responds, and that Brian is kind of quiet. Brian doesn't know what is going on. Brian is possibly concerned as well, but also like, well, you guys must sort it out. What is going on? I like this explanation because it doesn't make anyone right or wrong. It's just sort of something that happens, and it's not someone is being a creep or whatever. It's just kind of how things turn out. Now the problem with this comment is, and I think I did follow up with Margaret, because she says, I understand that blah 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 blah. Well, how do you understand? Did you read it on somewhere on Facebook or whatever? The other thing is, I think the restaurant manager would have sort of mentioned it. But I think, didn't someone say that there was a problem with the bill? There was a problem with the payment. And some people have said that Gabby may have been upset by just how much it was or something like that. So the other thing is, I think the story is that Gabby ended up paying outside. If you remember hearing that Gabby paid outside. Now, that part puts this into a little bit of doubt, because unless the server followed her with one of those card machines that's not connected, then it seems unlikely. The other thing is, she paid outside, which is different to the story. I mean, she wouldn't have paid if the card had already done a double thing. It may have been something like to make these stories line up, it could be something like her card was declined and she went out to get another card or went to draw cash, and that's why she returned to the restaurant and she was quite upset about that. It could be something like that. I don't know. Kami Burchett. But Launcher Detective says maybe she thought Brian paid and he didn't. Wind Whisper says maybe she used a second card. So all I'm saying is, what I found useful about this particular comment is it opens your mind up to a different possibility than, Brian was abusive or angry, or Gabby was whatever, or the restaurant, the waitress was this. You could have a situation that's completely almost normal that anyone in that situation would get quite upset with. That's kind of my point. And but the bottom line is that Gabby, I think, was upset that day, and it may have been about money. That, I think, is the bottom line. Thomas says, did Brian have a job? Did Brian ever have a job? Yes, Brian did work at a what do you call it? Not a greenhouse, not a plantation. What do you call it? He worked at a place that sells plants. Publix. Yeah, he also worked at a supermarket. That's at Garden Center Nursery. He worked I think when he lived in Long Island, in New York, he worked at a plant nursery, and then also at a grocery, Publix. Is that the same thing, though? I'm not quite sure if is Publix and the nursery the same thing, or are they two different things? I'd imagine two different things. Jason, thank you, says she paid for Brian. They fought over dinner. She demanded her money back for his meal. I think there was a fair amount of her paying for him. I think she was more financially in a stronger position than he was, I think. Although his parents were also, I think, holding the fort in that department. I don't know if she demanded her money back for his meal. I don't know if I agree with that. Tommy says Publix is a grocery store chain, and Publix is not in New York. So there are two places where Brian worked. He worked at a grocery store called Publix and also a nursery. And then he also sold some of his drawings. And I went through some of that yesterday or the day before in a video about their Depop account, where you see some of the stuff they sold, and they sold about $1,300 worth of product. So, but Gabby did seem to be the harder worker and the more entrepreneurial. I kind of got that impression. And also, Gabby was asking her mother for money. I'm not sure how many times she did. Interesting to know. I don't know whether Brian did. I don't know whether Brian did that, but Brian did sort of. I think Brian contributed to the purchase of the van. The van was in Gabby's name, but I think Brian did a lot of work inside the van. Brian actually did some of the paneling inside and that kind of thing. He modified the van, that's right. Okay. Why did Brian take her keys and lock out of the van afterwards? Yeah, well, he certainly was the aggressor in that instance. He was I see someone wants to have a word fight, seems to be. Morris says his parents are the ones with money. Thought Criminal says Nick reminds me of a Norse Viking. Okay, well, since I really like Uhtred of Bebbanburg and The Last Kingdom, I'll take that as a compliment. Okay, so yeah, Stephanie says his parents bounced a check, according to the people who sold that caravan thing. So, okay, so that's bringing us to the next point. My van life experience in the UK. I'm sharing this with you to share something that was, I think, a lot like Gabby and Brian experienced. It was bittersweet. There were some fun moments, and there were some not so fun moments, to put it lightly. So can you guys see that? Maybe, can you see that? It's not quite in focus. Should I try and take it all the way to the thing? That's not very clear. Anyway, this is a picture of me standing next to a Ford Escort in the UK, and we'd hired this vehicle, and I was the designated driver. We were three people, my girlfriend and her parents, but I was the only one who had a license to drive. So I was driving us around, which in a way is perhaps similar, not quite the same, but perhaps similar to Brian being the designated driver. And so in a way that's nice and maybe an honor, but in another way, well, aren't you just there because for your utility? You're being used by someone else to get around, right? I don't know if my girlfriend's parents at that time really liked me very much. And I think part of why we went on the trip was because they wanted to get out and they needed someone who's going to drive. And so there I came along. And one thing I remember from that trip was we stopped somewhere in the middle of nowhere and watched football for like hours and hours and hours. And that wasn't my idea. So, yeah. So this is kind of a highlight from the trip. That's me driving across, I think, Tower Bridge. And London was so busy that was going to be impossible. So it was quite a nice moment driving across. I think that's Tower Bridge. I could be wrong. But this was a low light. This was a low light from the experience. And this is kind of like van life. Now, if you're seeing what looks like a bottle, you might think, well, once upon a time I was an alcoholic or a tramp or something. This was actually sleeping inside that vehicle that I've showed you. and I think it was New Year's, if I'm not mistaken. It was New Year's, and we were close to, not quite sure what the area is, but it's very close to the White Cliffs of Dover. And I think that was a bottle of champagne. And it was very uncomfortable. It wasn't even a camper. I was sort of sleeping in the boot area of that Ford Escort with the seats down. And it just was a very cold, unpleasant experience. And you feel cramped and just not fun at all. And I don't know if you can see it on my face. I don't know if you can see my face there, but I think I said take this photo just to show how miserable this was. And there was a hotel down the road, but we just felt that we couldn't afford it, so we didn't stay there. And so this was, I think, the next day. So it was this sort of area in England. There you can see the White Cliffs. Sorry that it's not such good quality. I might put better quality shots of this on Patreon or something. But this was a photo taken, I think, the night before the sleeping in the car. Yeah, I was very, very uncomfortable. I don't know if you can see that. Can you see? Can't quite make out the details, unfortunately. But I think my expression there also says it all. And then I think we slept in the car a second night, and that was, I think, in Stratford upon Avon. And I remember that being a horrible experience, and just thinking at that, I just remember thinking, wow, I'm such a loser, and I don't like living like this, and what does she think of me as a boyfriend, and all that kind of thing. And I wonder whether that didn't come up with Brian and Gabby, especially if Gabby was paying some of the bills. When that discomfort reaches a certain point, don't you sort of feel you're not protecting me, you're not taking care of me, this is not fun, this is not, I want to be not just taken care of, but I want to be able to stay in a hotel, I want to be able to eat at a restaurant. And when you're a guy without a job, it's quite difficult, or not a very well-paying job, it's not very easy to keep paying for that sort of thing. Timmy, come boy, come. Okay, yes, Timmy, guys. Are you guys ready for your best questions? Hopefully I can distract you while I find them with Timmy. Timmy, can you do like a circus act and just distract everyone? By the way, Timmy's going to have a haircut tomorrow, the day after, so you must enjoy the, what do you call it? The hairy Timmy, because he's going to be a different animal very soon. Yeah, look at his eyebrows. Timmy, look at your eyebrows. Huh? Yeah, he's quite fluffy at the moment. Okay, so I just want to say one more thing about the Merry Piglets. So I heard a rumor that Gabby had left a Yelp review at the Merry Piglets. I went to the Yelp site for the Merry Piglets, and I went through all 560 odd Yelp reviews, and I didn't find a single review. Yelp does come up in the sense that a legal letter was sent to Steve, the laundry's lawyer, Steve Bertolino, and it was dated 22nd September, the day after Gabby was found. And it was, I think, a cease and desist letter just saying that, I'll just read it. The Petito and Schmidt family are demanding that you remove Gabby Petito's picture from your Yelp page. The web page is, and it's given over there, says the family tried to remove their daughter's picture from your page and were informed that only the business owner can remove it. But I did hear that some people said that Gabby had left a Yelp review, and that's not, I certainly couldn't find it. If she had, it certainly would have provided some insight into what really happened there. I do think the Yelp reviews of the Mary Piglets can give you an indication of what other people expected and experienced at that restaurant. Timmy, can I put you down? Timmy, can I put you down? Timmy, can I put you down? Okay. Okay, I need to put him down so I can navigate these questions. I'm going to just put a link on here so you can read that article if you haven't read it already. Okay, let's see what we got here. So there's a question or a comment about Brian Laundrie. Someone said, I find myself thinking about the notebook. The one item they've told us was outside of a pack. If legible, it could be a treasure. But what about what else was packed in the bags or what was omitted? Did he even bring water or food, a flashlight or knife? I do hope they are out searching for more items, bones, shelter, wrappers. Things left behind showing he was there a certain amount of time. So that's a really good point, and it also shows kind of state of mind. Someone says a little chair. Was a chair found? But you would imagine that if he intended to be there for any length of time, that he would have brought food along. He would have brought a flashlight or a knife or something like that. The one thing we know that he did bring along was the water bottle, and the water bottle does suggest that he didn't think about it. Taking the water bottle means that, or suggests that he didn't mean to take his life immediately, or didn't mean to take it at all, right? The fact that you take water with you means that, well, I'm going to drink this to quench my thirst later on. Does that make sense? Terry Dean says that was my question. So this is Terry Dean's question. So yeah, we would want to know, did he take a flashlight along? To see at night. What was what sort of preparations did he make? That is definitely going to give you an idea of his state of mind. And so far, it doesn't appear that anything has been found other than, well, they did find a bag. What is in the bag? Other clothing items, one wonders what was in there. Where would he have sourced potable water out there? That's also quite a good question. If you look at some of the drone footage right now, there's water, sort of pools of water right there. The question is it potable? I just don't know. Does anyone from the area know whether you could drink the water in the park? You could just sort of dunk your water bottle in there and drink that. Could you? Not potable. It's full of water, just boil it. Well, you'd have to make a fire. People say bacteria. But I mean, if you imagine, there's a hurricane or whatever and water is flowing in there, is it not water that you can drink? Sharon says it's swamp water, so not drinkable. I'm not saying it would taste good. I'm just wondering whether you could drink it. Remy says, no, you cannot drink the water unless you purify it. You would need a metal can to boil. Sunset says you can drink with a live straw. They are drinking faucets. Okay, that's interesting. So there are faucets in that sort of area. You can get purifying tablets. Pauline says there are restrooms in the park, aren't there, with running water? Yeah, interesting. E. Miller says if you have a strong immune system, you can drink and live. Okay, so let's just go to another question. This is from Joe Lenhart. He says, this was a business venture, not a honeymoon. I think that is so well put, because that ultimately is what it was. It probably felt like a honeymoon when they were preparing for it, but when they were actually doing it, so the reality of it was that it probably felt like a business venture. It felt probably very unromantic, moments that were romantic, but mostly they were probably coming up against the limits of what you can afford, and that's not fun or romantic. It's not nice to go on a trip only to be forced along this or that direction because of what you can afford. And I went through that when I traveled through Australia, where I won't go through that again, but it's certainly not a fun trip when you don't have that choice, right? Catherine Hargrave says it was a business venture for Gabby. She wanted a lucrative influencer lifestyle. Brian just wanted a rugged trip. I do get that sense that Brian wanted to almost just be along for the ride. Brian just wanted to enjoy the trip, and maybe Brian saw it as a honeymoon. I think Gabby, I don't think one can say Brian quit his job to go on this, whereas Gabby did. And the fact that Gabby wasn't living at home, and Gabby was very much the initiator behind the YouTube channel. She's the owner of the YouTube channel. She did far more social media in terms of, she made that YouTube video. She also did social media in terms of her Instagram account. I think it's got a third more posts. And then also she did other social media such as Depop and so on. So you kind of got the sense that she was kind of on the ball, that she was trying to make something happen. And it sort of feels like Brian thought, well, I can just go home if things don't work out, or if we run out of money, we can just go home. Whereas Gabby wanted to keep going. Gabby wanted to make this work because she invested so much more in it. Sally says, Leanne, I think you're right. Let's see what Leanne says. Gabby wanted to finish the relationship and he snapped. I don't know if that's true. I don't know whether, it could also be in that Brian said, we need to go back, on the 27th. He may have said to her, we can't keep going away from home. We need to turn back, or can we stop doing the social media? Or they had an argument about the social media. What are we going to post on social media? Kind of thing. So I don't know, if you look at Gabby during the Moab incident, if you'd think there would be the place for her to say, I want to end the relationship, and she was actually tearful that there might be a court case or something. She wanted to just get a ticket. And I don't know, I kind of get the feeling, I could be wrong, but I get the feeling that the Moab incident was a lot worse in terms of the fighting than the Mary Piglets. I could be wrong. What happened after the Mary Piglets, though, is a different story. But I think the Mary Piglets showed that they couldn't afford what is going on, that they were running out of money. And Brian may have confronted her on this, and who knows. Bria says, Nick, I think that COVID times was playing a major part on their finances. Yeah, I also think COVID was playing a major part in their minds. I think if you took COVID away, this need to break out and be free and to get out probably wouldn't have been as strong as it was. Annie Rose says, I think Gabby's family were more affluent. I'm not sure if that's true. I think her stepfather's a fireman, or I'm not sure if I'm right about that, and her biological dad's a salesman, not 100% sure. But the fact is she had two sets of parents, which maybe sort of lightened the load. I don't know whether, you could say Brian's family were wealthier, but if you're selling property, you can sometimes have your money caught up in deals and investments, and may not be that available. So Stargirl has quite an interesting comment. She says, I think they were both physically abusive towards each other. Stargirl, what is so sad, I think, about all of this is because there were so many episodes, so many dramas, I think what happens is, it passes that line in the sand where it's like, this is, there are now red flags going up. There's now danger. This is now, you sort of cross the line. And because all of those dramas have happened so often, shouting, hitting, breaking up, getting back together, other people don't notice it anymore. It's like, oh, they're just having another argument. But they themselves may not notice it either. They themselves may not notice, do you realize how stressed you are? Do you realize how anxious you are? Do you realize where things are going? That things have now become actually unhinged. We need to de-escalate this. And if you're so used to things escalating and sort of if you're so used to arguing that, another argument just feels like another argument when it may not be. It may be the last argument you ever have, which is why you don't want to get into a pattern of just arguing. Every argument you actually want to not contain, but you don't want to argue until the cows come home. You want to disagree, and if you argue, try and limit because arguments aren't fun. That break the things that hold people together, right? When arguing becomes normalized, isn't that then the currency of a relationship, arguing? And do you remember the first words Gabby said to the officer during the Moab incident? He said, what's going on? And she said, well, we've been fighting all morning. Big Lock Joker says, I felt my opinion didn't matter. Not sure what that's referring to. What was really underlying his anger is the point. What may have been underlying his anger is the reality that he wasn't really a person of substance, the reality that although he's a guy, he couldn't really deliver. He couldn't look after her, perhaps. And also in social situations, maybe he wasn't... you could also say in social media situations, Gabby was getting the upper hand. Perhaps she didn't like that. Perhaps that confirmed his insecurity. You could also say he was angry because he was bald. He didn't like being bald. He didn't like his youth being taken away from him at the same time that Gabby's beauty was only increasing and enhancing. So at the same time that she's becoming even more beautiful, he's becoming kind of, what did the one TikToker say, that he was like an average looking guy? Well, she wasn't. So if you have the one person who's becoming more attractive, and people, that it does happen to young people, they just become more and more and more attractive. Well, a guy who's going bald, I don't know if you're easily going to feel like, wow, I'm actually becoming more attractive. So that can be quite stressful, I think. Corporal D, hi Nick from Australia, thanks for talking about Cleo. We will talk a little bit about her in a moment. I just want to get through this. Lou says, can you honestly put this down to looks? I'm not saying it's all about looks. I think the finances play a role. But think about when you were 20 years old, your looks are a big deal. part of what attracts one young person to another young person when you don't have a job, when you're at school, is looks. I mean, that is how it starts. How it continues are all the other things. Stargirl says, I think Brian is very insecure. I do too. Karen says, insecure about being bald at 23. Yeah, I mean, I lost my hair at 27. I started losing my hair at about 27, 28, and not fun. I didn't expect it to happen. And it's certainly a period of, a long period of change and transition that, can be difficult to deal with. Sharon says, beautiful people can have a black heart. That's also true. That's the other side, is Brian seemed to have a chip on his shoulder about other people. Remember, Brian didn't really have friends. Gabby seemed someone who was capable of making friends and having friends. Brian seemed kind of more antisocial. Okay, so let's go on to another question. So Joe Leonard, thanks for your comment there. This was a business venture, not a honeymoon. Debbie Sims says, it seems hard to discuss without blaming women or blaming men, right? So she was saying, I think it's useful to look at how young men navigate their way emotionally into becoming adults. It seems hard to discuss without blaming women or blaming men. It seems so easy to name one gender as the villain and be done with it, but that's not the way to health. So I like what she says here, because I think there are a lot of people who want Brian Laundrie to be the villain and Gabby to be the angel, and it tends to be not quite as simple as that. Someone listening here will say, wow, I can't believe you're actually justifying what he did. No, it's just to say that Brian wasn't perfect, and he also wasn't total evil, and also that Gabby wasn't perfect and she wasn't totally good. In other words, she was a normal person, ordinary person, and so was he. And then at some point, things went the way that they went. I think it's quite difficult to discuss, and how I do it, how I try to stay in the safe lane is rather just discuss Gabby as a person on her own terms. The things she said, the things that her girlfriend said about her, the things that we see her saying, all within that context. There you have it. And then you deal with Brian on his own terms. You don't sort of go, what did Brian think of Gabby? What did Gabby think of Brian? What did Brian do to Gabby? What did Gabby do to Brian? Just because we don't really know that. You very seldom see them actually together, other than in the sort of fake Instagram clips of them on the beach at sunset and so on, or smiling together in the tent. But that's not really real. The real way to have gotten like a sense of them is from what happened in front of the Moonflower Co-op. That would be the reality. That would be authentic. What really happened. I think the other thing that is important is the books that they were reading and what the books say about gender and gender roles, which I don't think it was terribly constructive. Batman says the Moab police greatly escalated the situation. Did they? I mean, I think the Moab incident escalated the situation. The fact that the police came there, but the police themselves, I don't think, I don't know. I thought they did terribly well, but they also could have done a lot worse. Ultimately, they were quite nice to both of them. It wasn't as though, although they did put the blame on Gabby, they were sort of sympathetic to both of them. Perhaps more to Brian than to Gabby, which certainly didn't help. But I think you must also just remember who committed the crime. It wasn't the Moab police, it was these people. He sure did support her. Well, yeah, that certainly wasn't very nice. The Moab police entitled Brian, I think that's true, but yeah, I suppose you could take that side then. So you could say Brian is evil. The police are also evil because they made him do what they did, and you can take that line, and it's very simple, isn't it? Very, very simple. Corporal D probably wants to talk about Brian's story. Reminds me a bit of what happened in the series You. Yeah, I've heard that. I've heard that come up a few times. Also want to know how much they were influenced by movies, that were current at the time that they were going out there. That would really be interesting. Melinda says Brian manipulated police. I agree with that. I do think our conversations about this say a lot more about us than it says about them. So if you take a particular view and it's a gender thing or whatever, it often, I think, reflects what you're projecting into this. And are you being curious about who these people are, or are you inserting yourself into it? Just something to bear in mind. A lot of people who hate Brian, I think you must try and remember that Gabby loved him. What did she love about him? What did her parents like about him? Bear in mind she was engaged to him. So what qualities did he have that were good? I know you don't want to have that conversation. You'd prefer to, let's try and make it as bad as we possibly can. I would rather we find out what actually happened, not exaggerate or minimize. You want to just know what happened. I have actually been wanting to do the Moab incident, but another case came along, Cleo Smith. Otherwise, I would have started it this week. JD says Moab police were brilliant, spent so much time and gave a great deal of consideration to their situation. The park ranger, I just lost your comment. The park ranger lady, I think you were saying, was so good or something. Don't know what happened to that comment. The park ranger lady probably precipitated their breakup. That's definitely an interesting point, because we know that I can't remember her name, I did cover it. She did say, Gabby must be careful, maybe this feels like a toxic relationship. And who knows whether Gabby repeated what she said to him. So Brian may have felt like he came out of the Moab incident ahead, and that he'd sort of successfully manipulated everybody until he heard what the park ranger told her. Thanks, Corporal D. Thanks, Stephanie, for thanking her. Okay. Maz says quite a good point. Don't forget Brian has not been proven guilty. I think people have also forgotten that. Nothing is certain in this case. We don't know for a fact that he committed suicide. We don't know for a fact that he killed Gabby. There are certainly, there are certainly things to consider that lead you down certain paths. But I'm just saying legally, one's got to be careful in that respect. Then this is a comment from some time ago by someone called CS, who said, Shakespearean tragedy, you are really crazy. This was no different than any other toxic couple. I can't believe the fantasy and delusion people have around these two. Do you guys agree with that? This wasn't a Shakespearean tragedy. This was no different than any other toxic couple. What do you guys think? I think it's quite different to other toxic couples. Brian seemed like quite a good guy. If you took away the Moab incident, if you took away the end result, up until the moment Gabby died, Brian seemed like quite a good guy. He was driving her kind of around. He was engaged to her. He was part of her life for the past 2 years or something. They were doing a lot of things together. They had photos of themselves. They traveled before. They traveled to California. They had quite a few pictures of themselves in a hammock and reading, and they were working together with their Depop e-commerce site. They were both artists. So you certainly had the other side of that story where they were getting along quite well and had known each other quite a while, and she was even living, with him and kind of other family members, and they'd taken her in under their wing, kind of thing. So I don't know if it's just that they were toxic. I think there wasn't a toxic aspect. Rose Davis said that he was. He had episodes, and I think she even said that he heard voices or something like that. But if they were just like anybody else, any other toxic couple, why did this make news? Gabby was suffering from anxiety. He was also. Do all toxic couples suffer from anxiety? I would imagine, and forgive me for saying this, but I would imagine that a lot of toxic couples are substance abusers, and they didn't seem to be. In the Summer Wells case, can you think of a toxic couple? In the Summer Wells case, can you think of people who use certain substances regularly? Now, which one would you say is a conventional toxic couple? I don't know. My response to this person saying it's not a Shakespearean tragedy, it's no different, I said, instead of arguing why it's not important to you or no different to anyone else, you could perhaps consider why it has resonated with so many people at this particular time in the human story. I know one reason it's resonated with me is because I felt like I lived a fraction of it. During my travels, I wasn't on the road for as long as they were, and there were other things going on, but it certainly brings back some good and bad memories for me. What about you guys? Does Gabby's and Brian's van life journey bring back your youthful travels and youthful folly? Margie says one can relate to the youthful dreams. Absolutely. Thanks, Jedi. Jedi Bunny. Okay. Marcy says it's very hard to break off. Yeah, it can be. That's, I think, the other thing is when you see this, a couple of things come up. One is, what are the symptoms? And the other thing is, and I did a video about it, what could Gabby have done differently? And meaning, with all the information we have now, how could Gabby have, and it's a bit unfair because Gabby didn't know, but how could Gabby have navigated a way out of it? And it's difficult when you know the situation. She didn't want to travel without Brian. She wanted Brian in terms of the business side of the relationship, she wanted him to drive and to probably take photos of her and probably as a companion and as a protector. So I don't know if the relationship ended, so would the business venture. And perhaps Brian didn't like that juxtaposition. Perhaps he saw it the other way around, that it's a honeymoon, it's a relationship, and the business venture is just a sideshow, and if it doesn't work out, that's fine. Whereas I think for Gabby, it had a different thing, it had a different priority. Rebecca says, did they have a history of mental illness? I think they did have you could say, a history of anxiety, and this has been an anxious time for a lot of people. It's also been difficult to work sort of as a waitress or in that sort of situation. So, Val, thanks very much. I appreciate that. Brittany says very codependent relationship. Yeah. Sherry says she didn't deserve to die, but breaking up while on a close quarters trip is not a good idea. But she did get on his nerves. He probably got on her nerves. They probably both got on one another's nerves. But possibly, there was that, and also there were fun times. I don't know if you guys have heard, Brian is playing a kind of a banjo, like a guitar. They're sort of at a campsite and he's playing, and it actually feels very calm and restful and pleasant. Have you guys heard that? And so I'm sure there were many times that were pleasant. I see there are 800 people in chat, but only 300 likes. Let's see if we can get it up to 500. Where is Timmy? Well, he's not in this room. I don't think he's getting the ASMR effect tonight. Okay, let's go on to another question, and then we're going to come on to Brian's silence via Ernest Becker, via the birth and death of meaning. Stephanie says he had left. Why come back? He should have stayed in Florida. Someone said that he left to get something out of a container that he was going to take back because they decided to, I think it was actually the lawyer, that they decided, it was something I read, I think in the Daily Beast or Newsweek, one of those, and so the lawyer said something about that Brian returned after an argument. When I first read that, I thought they argued and then Brian immediately went to Florida, but it actually meant, well, they argued during the Moab incident, then some time went by, and then he came back, and then apparently retrieved something from the locker for their trip, whether it was a laptop or what, I don't know. But who knows, Brian may have said, either I'm done or I need a break, or I don't know if I want to continue, and then maybe he decided he did, or maybe he got some money when he went back home. Well, one thing that is for sure is the week or so spent in that hotel in Salt Lake City, that must have cost some money as well, right? That whole week spent in a hotel, was that absolutely necessary? Yeah, Stephanie says a flight when short on funds. Yeah. Timmy went for a snack. Okay. Next question. Jennifer Riggs, depending on many factors, a body can skeletonize in as little as 3 weeks. Actually, I've heard people say in as little as a week in Florida. So it can take as short as a week for that to happen. I would argue that it can take as little as a few days if you've got wild animals. So it could literally be stripped down within a day or two if you've got those animals in place. So I think we were all surprised. Certainly, if you take some of the cases we've done, and I've used Lacey Peterson as a comparison. She was out in San Francisco Bay for, I think, 3.5 months. So in water. I think the conditions were different because I think she was wrapped in a tarp with chicken wire around her. But quite a different situation there to here, isn't it? Elena says, I don't believe that there's no video of Gabby while at the hotel. Stephanie says, and the heat and elements much faster than Wyoming. I need to plug in my phone, which is going to die. Okay, let's go through a couple more questions. I don't see Brian as a sympathetic character at all. You seem to, though, and when I listen to you, I can almost agree with you. So I wasn't quite sure what to make of, because it almost seemed like a criticism. How dare you sympathize with Brian? I think in true crime, and it's certainly where I try to approach these cases, is I don't try to be on anybody's side, and I also don't try to sympathize with anyone. I just try to understand what happened, and in particular the dynamic. You can't get to the dynamic, the exchange of feelings and emotions, the character of the relationship, without understanding both people. And you don't understand a person when you just put them in a box and judge them. So in order to understand the true dynamic, the authentic relationship between Brian and Gabby, you've got to let them speak for themselves. You've got to try and be honest about what this person is like, good qualities and bad qualities. And that applies to Gabby as well. And so if you're doing that, it's also not saying, well, I don't sympathize with Gabby, I sympathize with Brian. You are kind of just trying to understand both of them in order to understand what is going on between them, right? So this is my response. She also said, what I really want to know and consider is what can we do to stop the women, too many women, from being killed? This is from the same person. And so my response was, I said, it's a great question. I'm not sure if it's a question for men, though, because I just feel like it's a man imposing something on a woman. You should do this or don't do that. I don't know if it's fair, but if the question is being asked to me, then I would say perhaps women should consider the question themselves. I do have this is what I wrote here. I do have a few ideas based on some work I did on the Ripper investigation. So the Ripper investigation was about this person who didn't kill one woman, but many, over and over and over again. And the question then was, like, what are we going to do? So it was kind of like, what are women going to do and what are men going to do? And are men going to tell women what to do, or are women going to tell men what to do? And it was actually quite frustrating and frightening and scary, because you actually had women kind of saying, we refuse to be prisoners in our own home, and we're actually going to go out and party to prove that. And then someone else would get killed. So on the one hand, you can say, kudos to you, it's don't be afraid. But on the other hand, you kind of had the situation of this relentless predator. And, how on earth do you investigate this and stop this from happening, when you can sort of not rely on, I won't say the cooperation of women, but it's sort of like women saying, we're not going to be afraid, we're just going to go out there. So it's like, and I realize this is really controversial. Some people will say, how dare you, or whatever. But, part of what I think is healthy is fear, is to say, and being a little bit cautious. So you say, that could happen, I'm going to be careful. And I'm not saying it is right that you have people walking around that do harm, but it is a reality. I'm not saying it's right, I'm just saying it's a reality. And I think there was one instance where someone said in a bar, "Are you really going to leave by yourself with the Ripper running around?" And they were like, "Yes." And then I'm not sure if that person actually became a victim, but what that puts into perspective is this thing of how are you going to respond and what is the response for men and women. You get what I'm saying? It is really Pian, I don't think so. I don't see the link there, but who knows? It is certainly something that is being spoken about by a lot of people. Healing Vibration says family members can also be perpetrators. Yeah. I was always taught that, and something I witnessed with other women was that the moment a man hits a woman, it's over. He shouldn't be in a relationship anymore, and she shouldn't either. And if you watched the thing on Netflix, Made, at one point the boyfriend hits right next to her head, hits the wall. I don't think he ever hits her, but that to me is also part of that conversation, is that once you've reached that point, it's over. And with Gabby and Brian, they seem to be hitting each other. So they seem to have passed that point. So I do think what needs to be established with people is, certainly in your mind, you must be aware that this is actually a line that shouldn't be crossed. And once it's crossed, you must be prepared to walk away, because otherwise your life is literally at risk. So you need to, first of all, acknowledge it and absorb it and be educated on it. And the second thing is to act on it when you're in that situation. None of which it's not very easy when you are in that situation. Okay, so next one. This is from Ziggy Pop. She often makes really good comments. She said, "I've learned something recently, albeit very morbid. I thought it took months for bodies to decompose, not just a couple of weeks." So I think we've all learned something in terms of the certainly in terms of Florida. Remember, this had conditions in Florida, right? In summer in Florida, those conditions aren't typical everywhere. They certainly weren't typical in Wyoming. And what happened to Brian isn't what happened to Gabby. So I don't think it's accurate to say that Brian's body simply decomposed. It was just like he fell down and then he turned into a skeleton through decomposition, through bacteria and whatever. I think you've got to remember it's a combination of scavenging and decomposition, more than likely a lot of scavenging, and there were a lot of scavengers. Those vultures that you see in that drone cameraman's footage are big birds. They're like turkey-sized, and there were about 10 of them right around the corner from where Brian was. So you can reasonably expect that they were actually scavenging, actually the scavengers. Andar says, "I used to see posters about abuse shelters and didn't want to admit they were about my husband." Wow, sorry to hear that. Pian says, "Things decompose more quickly in tropical heat." So just based on what I've come across through reading dozens, if not hundreds, of comments, there are a lot of people who have been victims of abuse and are here because that's the part that's resonating with them. And so if you say this is a toxic relationship just like anyone else, in a way it is. It's still a tragedy. And I think it's so much more tragedy because they were such young people, and it was so unnecessary for what happened to happen. Wasn't there another alternative? Couldn't things have ended differently for both of them? The other thing that I think is important to bear in mind is Brian didn't just lose his life and the decomposition happened anywhere. It happened in a wild reserve where there are wild critters by definition, where there are more wild animals than usual, right? A lot more than usual. And so if you can't imagine that, well, you need to imagine exactly where it was and all these animals walking around. And these animals are hungry. This I found very interesting, and Feminist Chick says I disagree. I think Stephanie says to Feminist Chick, I disagree. Let's see what Feminist Chick says. If you're a straight woman, you have been in an abusive relationship at some time in your life. I don't think that is true. I've kind of got a question just because I've read some of the comments people make. If someone raises their voice to you, is that abuse? If you raise your voice to someone, is that abuse? Brits Creek says alligators don't eat very often. They go months without feeding. Also more insects, that's true. So Brianna says, yes, it's verbal abuse. So if you take that on and you say, okay, no, this is really wrong, you shouldn't raise your voice. Can I ask you, have you ever raised your voice at anybody in your life? Like, not sure your age, but in your entire life, have you ever raised your voice to somebody? Tommy says it depends on the words. Okay. Stephanie says raising a voice is different than yelling. But, it's quite a difficult thing to get into, but if you say raising your voice is abuse, okay, it's abuse. Is disagreeing abuse? Like if someone says, I want to watch X on Netflix, and someone says, no, I want to watch Y. No, let's watch X. Is disagreeing abuse? Like, so, you know what I mean? So what I'm trying to get at is abuse can eventually cover almost everything where you don't agree with what somebody else does. But is it abuse? If there's lovemaking going on, and no, I just mean this in a normal scenario where people are happily and in love, but it's actual lovemaking and bodies are pounding one another. And at some point you push your lover down to get up to go, is that abuse? Because you pushed that person. And you can say no. And so, yes, it's all to do with context. What is the intent behind the yelling? What is the intent behind the pushing, whatever? And is the person in control of what they're doing, kind of thing. I don't think you can sort of say that raising your voice, unless you're saying something like, and if the words are particularly threatening, well, then it is. But what seems to be happening now is the smallest thing can also be abuse. So you can literally turn yourself into a victim and your partner into an abuser, when actually your partner hasn't meant to do that. But if that's how you want to see it, then I guess it can be. It's a difficult road because it depends on the intent, your intent, and the other person. Yvonne Phillips, thanks so much, Yvonne. Yvonne says, I think the lines between men and women are badly blurred. When hardwired standards are watered down or changed by enlightened society, both sexes suffer the consequences. So you can imagine if you're in a relationship with someone sincerely and genuinely, and you sort of make a mischievous comment or do something, and someone said, hey, that was abusive, that's actually going to turn you off that person, especially if you didn't mean any harm. But, if everything you do, oh, you crossed that little line, that little line. But by the same token, if you do these things and you're not confronted and it's not communicated, and that to me is one of the things where I think men and women can, and whoever is in a relationship, is if you're transparent about what's going on, if you can communicate to someone what's going on when it's happening, it's more likely to have a good outcome than if that doesn't happen. And if you take the Gabby and Brian scenario, Brian was a quiet guy. Gabby didn't really have that many friends, but even the friend that she did have, she didn't confide in, as far as we know, and didn't confide in her mother. And in a weird way with Shanann Watts, when things were not going very well in North Carolina, she was actually visiting her family in North Carolina. Did she confide in her family about concerns about Chris Watts having an affair? And I'm just saying, if that communication had happened, would the perpetrator still have felt he had free rein to do something if what he's already doing is being communicated regularly? So I think communication, when there's a concern, is a big way to prevent things from escalating or going down that road. Does that make sense? Cheryl says, someone publicly being critical is abusive. You don't embarrass someone you love. Well, then I've had a lot of abusive book reviews. I think abuse also tends to be about people who know each other very, very well. People who know each other intimately. Maura says you're only as sick as your secrets. Yeah. Brits Creek says, I have to go. Enjoy your break. Cheers. Take care. Brits Creek's often got some interesting ideas. Often seems to disagree with what I have to say. Jen says, I'm sorry to Rebecca Pratt. Lou D says, I think Gabby didn't want to continue the arguments from my impression. I think she wanted the trip to go on. I don't know whether Brian did, and bear in mind, Brian had gone back before. Thanks, Jean. Good to see you. Bridget says verbal abuse is about power and control. I think good relationships and bad relationships are about control. I think anyone in a relationship wants control. And so two people wanting control, at some point you've got to give up control, and you've also got to allow things to go a certain way, sort of a negotiated thing with a couple, which often runs into something here or there. I've got a friend who got coronavirus, vaccinated himself, etc., etc. Everyone in the family is vaccinated and his wife isn't. And you can imagine a situation like that, wanting on either side, whether it's the wife in terms of her family or the husband in terms of the wife, you'd like to control that situation because you don't want your wife to get sick, or as the wife, you might be concerned about vaccines or whatever. I'm just saying, and they've been married for quite a long time. You can imagine this sort of is something that puts a little bit of strain under their relationship. So I want to read this comment by Valerie Cagle that I found quite touching. Valerie wrote, I did not expect to feel the surge of sympathy that I felt once I learned the remains recovered from the reserve were identified as Brian's. But now that I know he's dead, I do feel sadness for the loss of his life. And she says that impulse to punish him triggered in me because of what she thought he did to Gabby. That is gone now. He was young, spoiled, immature. Even after what he may have done, he could have and would have redeemed himself at some point. The potential was certainly there. The annoying self-righteousness, his inclination for the soapbox, the condescension, all of it now seems like any kid in their early 20s. And all of it seems like a thin veneer meant to disguise his insecurities and fears and doubt, a way to combat the emotional fallout of navigating childhood as a solitary, overweight kid rejected by his peers. That Gabby loved him, that someone like Gabby loved him, meant so much to him, said so much about him in his own mind. And so her rejection, the failure of that relationship, was unfathomable to him. I don't know. I wish he had turned himself in, faced the music, and accepted that his life would follow a very different trajectory. But the part that really stood out to me were the first words where she says, I did not expect to feel the surge of sympathy. And that's a reference to Brian. Is there anyone else that felt the same way? I felt that way. Very upset by what happened to Gabby, and then suddenly, wow, I don't know. Anyone else feel that way? Buffy says yes. Axie says compassion, and yes. Yvonne Robinson says yes. And to me, everyone here saying yes. To me, that is the you are good people in true crime, because what we want to do is connect with our own humanity. We don't want to come here and condemn and hate and be divisive and take sides. We want to connect with our own humanity. And so when this happens, and does Brian deserve our forgiveness or anything like that? I'm not sure that he does. Does he deserve our sympathy? I'm not sure that he does. But the fact that you feel it is a credit to you, right? We don't know what horrible things were done to Gabby, and we don't know. But the fact that you feel the way you do under these circumstances, I think, is a credit to you, because overall what you're seeing is the tragedy of the situation. If Brian did commit suicide, I do believe that he took it as punishment for himself for what he did. And people that argue that is absolutely not the case, I find that interesting, that you don't want to believe or even consider the possibility that he may have felt bad about what he did, that he loved someone, perhaps she didn't love him or whatever, and then he felt differently about things afterwards. And I think that is, anyway, I think it's an interesting area where some people do experience their own humanity, and that is why I think, in a way, this case is been such a high-profile case, is that we've explored our humanity and to some extent our inhumanity, but to a large extent our humanity through these two young people who have both lost their lives. And I think in a way you realize what we could still lose, or what, it's almost like the project, the human project is almost like Gabby and Brian. And in terms of this next chapter of human history, and are we going into the future with everything that is happening now, almost like van life is, naive, with no knowledge of the world, with very little ability to discern reality, and how is it going to end? Sharon Tuck says, I feel nothing for Brian or his parents. Okay, let's go on to the next one. Lucy says, there's a massive difference between Romeo and Juliet. Romeo didn't murder Juliet. He never abused her, taunted her, and made her feel insecure. Well, that was just a response to saying that this is a Shakespearean tragedy. When I came to the Oscar Pistorius case, the judge actually said, in terms of the Oscar Pistorius case, this is a Shakespearean tragedy. This is all the marks of a Shakespearean tragedy. And I don't think he meant Romeo and Juliet. Shakespearean tragedy is just a tragedy of huge proportions, epic proportions, something that is truly, truly tragic, something that really, really resonates. So Shakespeare wrote a lot of tragedies that weren't just Romeo and Juliet. I don't know if that's obvious or not. Silver Bullet wrote, how does this ending compare to the ending in the book he was reading in the Instagram photo? I think he's talking about Lullaby, but I guess it could also be Fight Club. We know Fight Club ends with, Fight Club actually begins and ends with sort of a gun in the guy's mouth. The gun in his mouth is sort of near the ending as well. I just want to ask, Healing Vibrations says, Nick, can you please get the video of Gabby at the van to see if Gabby used the DV hand sign? Okay, I've not heard about that. I also don't think that the Stan reference was what a lot of people are saying. I just don't believe that that's the case. Is Stephanie still here? Stephanie, have you finished Lullaby? Stephanie says, I think those tears were for himself. Susie, to anyone, says books are always different than film. Kathy Chase says, I have to say I found myself trying to defend my sympathy, and I am a victim of DV. I thought it was maybe my Stockholm syndrome. People who think this case black and white are not nuanced. Stephanie, you haven't got it yet. Wow, is it like on really serious back order? Okay, so that is something we still want to do, is a book club type review, especially of these particular books. So that's something that we might be doing in December, but certainly in the near future. Colleen Wares says, Nick, I really appreciate your perspective and your overall content. Wonder if you'd consider offering your analysis of the police officers who attended to the call in Moab. Corporal D says, Gabby showed the female police officer the DV hand sign on body cam. Do you have the the video clip to the second where we can see that? I haven't heard of that before. But to be honest, I don't know what the DV hand sign is. So it's a female officer, that DV hand sign. Okay. Stephanie says, Corporal D, thanks so much for your support. If that's true, that Gabby showed that sign, perhaps she was afraid to, like people have been saying that it wasn't a wise choice to end the van life thing or whatever, end the relationship when she was in close quarters with Brian. Maybe she knew that. So maybe she knew not to do that. something that I think is undeniable and definitely unfortunate is that Gabby was presenting a certain reality on Instagram, and that wasn't reality. So she was selling the van life dream. She was selling the fairy tale of how wonderful everything was, smiles and look at my loving boyfriend and everything's wonderful, but it wasn't. And how many of us are doing the same thing? In the Chris Watts case, think about the thriving narrative and what is actually going on in the last couple of weeks. And so, when you get caught up in that narrative where you are saying something on social media that's not true, what is it like to be someone else that is just a bit player in your story? In other words, you're presenting a story, and I'm talking in general, you present a story of happiness to the world, and you are someone who is part of this person's world, and you're not happy about something, but everything just gets presented in a certain way. What do you think? What kind of message do you think that sends? Nick's the sign is an open palm, fold thumb in, and place fingers over. Oh, like that. Okay, that I think is the DV sign. Okay, so I will be dealing with the Moab incident in detail. I would have been dealing with it if the Cleo Smith case hadn't happened. It's just been a very busy time in true crime lately. Healing Vibration says, yes, can you please redo the sign? It's really important. So it's open hand, thumb in, and then fingers over it, like that. By the way, this mark on my finger is not nail polish. It's I voted on Monday. So that's just a sign that I voted. So please don't jump to conclusions. Bridget Bowman says, I'm not sure Gabby realized she was in a volatile situation with Brian, actually. That's the question. I mean, during the Moab incident, did she realize it? And if she didn't, see, because of all the arguing and fighting, it muddies the ability to see, wow, things have actually gotten to this point, right? I do think because they were both young people, it's quite difficult to step out of that and see reality, because you are very much, in a way, at the mercy of your emotions. You feel, certain things you shouldn't do or whatever, but your emotions override you, especially when you're young, against better judgment. Ando says, I think they both just thought it was passionate. I do think that there were things that overstepped the mark with, I was going to say both of them, but let's just say overstepped the mark. But they did it so regularly that it probably felt normalized. Anyway, next question. This is from Julie. She says, I have a question about the lawyer. He instructed the laundries to exercise the right to remain silent to protect them from, I don't know if it's from a confession, but certainly to protect them. A lawyer also studies ethics. What does ethics say about the right to remain silent in this human drama, in these consequences? I don't know if it's that clear. A defense lawyer is, in a sense, a different animal. A defense lawyer's job is to protect their client. Some of them see their jobs as to protect and defend their clients no matter what. So compare the defense lawyers in the O.J. Simpson case, of which there were, I think, 7, but many, and think about the defense the public defenders in the Chris Watts case. Sometimes the defense lawyer will try and protect you no matter what, and other times it's a little bit different. I must say I was surprised, and I'm still surprised, that they've taken the route that they've chosen to take, which is almost just to, it seems that they've just chosen to ignore the public, just, who, not so much who cares what you think, but it's almost like the media and the you had journalists approaching them like Brian Enton, but the media and the public, it's like, well, you don't have a legitimate concern, and if you do, so what? I don't have to talk to you, so I'm not going to. And one wonders if there was communication earlier, could Brian still have been alive? If something was communicated earlier, for example, where's Gabby? Could Brian have been in a different place to the one that he is in? I think that's something worth considering. Sunny Exposure, thanks very much. Great name, Sunny Exposure, especially for Australia. I also think, and we're going to deal with that in the very next thing, I just want to get through a couple more questions. Think about the fact that Brian is a quiet guy, and think about the silence of his parents, and think about if you in a relationship with someone, and I kind of got the sense that Gabby was also fairly quiet, not totally extravagant or whatever, but certainly less introverted than Brian. And sometimes when you're with someone that's quiet, it's not fun. I was on a trip not that long ago, and I was coming to the end of the trip, and a friend of mine was sitting on the seat next to me, quite a quiet guy, and I was actually starting to feel really sleepy, really tired, and he just wasn't talking to me because he's quite a quiet guy. And I was a little bit unhappy about that, just because I was trying to get us back safely. But I just mean the quiet aspect can be something that can be not good. Deal with that in earnest back in a moment. We're almost there. So another thing, this is from Beth Evans. She said, I think I've dealt with this. She said, I'm not sure that someone can strangle anyone they truly love and care for. I actually see it completely differently, that if you truly love and care for someone and something makes you believe that they don't love and care for you, then that passion is in play. In other words, you can feel betrayed, you can feel manipulated, you feel something. There's some emotion that comes about as a result of that. So, I think it's going too far into what we know and then just completely forgetting about the dynamics in people. If I take my puppy, who is now a year and a half old, I've done so much for him. I've taken him all over the place. And there's sometimes times where he is a very good little doggy, does as he's told, comes when I call him. And the other times where he obstinately just doesn't listen. Often there are other dogs that are part of the equation. And it feels a betrayal. And you feel upset. You're like, wow. And it's a silly example, but it's an example where there are other dogs that are causing him not to respect you or whatever it is. And so one wonders whether Gabby's social media caused Brian to feel like, wow, does she really love me? Is this really real? Can a stranger, random stranger who just says, I like your hair, threaten your engagement, your relationship with somebody else. And if you believe that it does, you can imagine how that feels totally defeating, that you lost everything just because someone, like you driving the vehicle every day, you do this, you do that, whatever. Someone else just puts a little comment on social media, and the next thing maybe you find out that there's been flirtation going on, and that person just left a comment or a like. How much effort did they really put in? How much commitment have they really shown? Is it fair, kind of thing? G. Winecoop says, I've felt that way with my dog. Batman says, I told you, Timmy is a Benedict Arnold Terrier. Okay. Stephanie says, I feel more hurt from those I love than someone I don't care about. Absolutely. I mean, when someone you love hurts you, when someone you love does something that's not very loving, it can make you feel terrible. So, and when you bring into that being very young, bring into that being very stressed, bring into that the lack of control of the van life situation, bring into that the discomfort of the whole van life thing, bring into that all the previous arguments, bring into that the Moab incident, bring into that the anxiety, you can see something can happen. Batman, thanks for that. And Sunny Exposure says, can Gabby's family demand or sue for more info from Mary Piglets and the laundries? I think what's happening right now is there is communication between the lawyers of both families. I think we can probably expect statements at some point, not in a too distant future. Mary Piglets, I'm not sure what's going to happen there. I'm not sure what's going to happen with Mary Piglets. I would love to know what happened with the FBI, because apparently the Mary Piglets were, they did make a statement to the FBI, so one would imagine that the right questions were asked, the certain facts were given, such as perhaps what food was ordered, what it cost, what time they were there, what time they left. What I think is just very unfortunate is that we don't have the CCTV footage from that. That definitely is, and perhaps the FBI also spoke to the waitress. That would give a much more accurate version, I think, from any of the versions we've gotten so far. I think that they can also, you could conceivably imagine a civil suit coming out of this, unless there's an agreement behind closed doors to do something. So I think there are definitely some legal aspects that are being dealt with right now. I think people are waiting for just the next steps in this investigation, the notebook and the autopsy results. Axie says, I'm sorry to say, but there's a sexual element to it, power and control. Yeah, I think that's actually a very important aspect of their relationship, of Gabby and Brian's relationship. I think there was quite a strong sexual element, just in the sense of Gabby's a 23-year-old guy. Gabby was attractive. I think it's also, you can love someone, but you can also be kind of sexually attracted to them and then jealous when your ability to be attractive is shown compared to somebody else. You look at someone else, or you notice someone else, or someone notices you, and it emerges over time that your partner is a lot more desirable than you are, or whatever. and that's despite your strong feelings of attraction to that person. Gabby needed, sorry, I missed a couple. Connie Carter says Amazon is selling Lullaby for Kindle and in paperback. Yeah, but I think there's a bit of a back order. Sharon Tuck says Nick has written over 100 books available on Amazon, Kindle, and 19 audiobooks on Patreon. I must say to you guys on Patreon, the next chapter in Treachery is like 11 pages long, and I'm just so overworked and don't have time, like so much is happening. I'm going to try and do it, but I mean, I basically got to leave this live and go and narrate that chapter, which is, as I say, 11 pages. I think I'm going to have to break it into two parts, but I'm really hoping I can finish Treachery before I get going. If I don't, I'm going to feel pretty lousy, especially for you guys. Healing Vibration says, Nick, the domestic violence silent hand alert gesture is a silent means of raising alert that they need help or feel threatened within a relationship. Okay, got it. Love Tina says, I think he let her see the side of him he didn't want to see. He didn't want her to see, and she didn't want to see, giving her doubts about wanting to marry. That might have been the bullet. That is certainly what I thought in the beginning, where it sounded like Brian was kind of misbehaving, to put it mildly, at Mary Piglets. But then another version was that he was the one that was calm. So it could actually be that Gabby was becoming more and more anxious, and it was in some way stressing out or upsetting him. But I also think that he was stressing her out. And so I think what happened, what was said during the Moab incident, where she said, he's stressing me out, he doesn't believe in me, he's a downer. I think all of those things were still in play several weeks later. And I think a big thing that can upset any person, especially an artist, is someone else close to you that doesn't believe in you, that says, no, I don't believe this is going to work. And I've got to say, where they were right then, Brian may have been right, that the social media thing wasn't going to work, certainly not the way they were going. They were needing to get YouTube up and running. They should have actually had their YouTube channel up and running before they got into the van. They should have gotten themselves to 1,000 subscribers before then, or something. So I hate to say Brian was right on that, but I think Gabby could have felt legitimately very wounded and very invalidated by the person that was supposed to believe in her the most. And it's quite a difficult one because on the one hand, you can say realistically, it didn't seem like it was working. On the other hand, Brian, what was Brian? What else was there to do? Brian didn't have a job. So even if it's not going to work out, put as much into it as you can. But that might feel a little bit different if you're putting more and more money into the vehicle and more time into things and nothing's really happening. It might feel counterproductive. Karina, thanks very much for that, Karina. Catherine says, Nick, I'm glad you're going to take a well-deserved break. Lou D says, the romance of their van life wore off rapidly. It was a fantasy in their case, fueled by social media. Yeah. Polly the primate, she was young and knew him from school. She probably felt she really knew him not to be a monster. Well, it's a totally different life at school and at home and beyond that. I think we all know that. High school life and home life is totally different to beyond. Sunny says Brian was a killjoy. Gabby was learning a lot about vlogging while doing it. A pity they didn't have more financial support from all the parents. Yeah. Okay, so let's just go on to the next one. Laurie Braxton said, I read a great post on philosophy of motherhood about the devouring mother, and it sounded so much like how many young people have been parented and are now completely overprotected and unable to function with others in society. I also like this quote, if you think tough men are dangerous, wait until you see what weak men are capable of. And then she said, I've just finished your Watts videos and they are fantastic. So excellent comment from Laurie. Let me just read it again. I read a great post on philosophy of motherhood about the devouring mother, and it sounded so much like how many young have been parented and are now completely overprotected and unable to function with others in society. I think about Chris Watts with that description, the way that one gets a sense he was somewhat over-parented by perhaps his mother. But he certainly seemed unable to function. I'm not sure what the reason is. Chris Watts was the way he was. He was very closed in and in his shell. One wonders where that came from. Was that from overparenting? Was that from being overprotected? I know I had a very perfectionistic mother, and we had a very good relationship, very close relationship, but she was very, very overprotective. I remember when I was 17 years old, she didn't think that Dallas was appropriate to watch. She thought it was, not appropriate for innocent young minds. So I don't know whether you can, I don't know how many of you here watched Dallas and would agree that she was right, but I certainly thought she was totally overprotective. I certainly felt when I went on this trip to England that I sort of felt that sense of having been protected at home and being very exposed. Paul T says, as someone from the UK, I was so disappointed that you dropped the Sod case. I'm sorry about that, Paul. I did want to cover it. What made it difficult was there was very little information. There was sort of the case, and then they didn't really release anything for quite a long time. One thing I feel disappointed about is I wanted to cover when the information did come out, I did want to cover that, but there's a combination of the huge amount of coverage that I had to give to the Summer Wells case and the Gabby Petito case, and then also when I did it on YouTube, people didn't seem particularly interested. Mark Reed says, I was made to watch Dallas from the age of 10 by my gran. Well, so for you it was a horrible experience. So I must say the Everard case really touched me, and I really wanted to cover it. But there are quite a few cases that I want to do that with. The Robert Durst case was another one. I don't know if you guys have heard. Durst is now being charged with the murder of his wife, Kathy. He was recently convicted for the murder of Susan Berman. Connie Carter says, love this program. Nick does a great job. Okay, so next one. This is from Gracie Rose Miller. She says, I don't understand why people think that Brian didn't contribute to the trip or have any money or he lived off of her. Is there anyone here that feels that way? Brian didn't contribute to the trip or didn't have any money or he lived off her. Anyone feel that way? Teresa Polgar, good evening. So she says, I don't understand why people think that Brian didn't contribute to the trip or have any money or he lived off of her. Gabby lived in his parents' condo while they both saved for the trip. They had a small car they sold to get the van, which was previously owned by Brian's parents. It was used in their juice equipment business. Gabby said that Brian worked and she had quit her job to work on her vlog/Instagram. They were planning on working on an organic farm to make some money to continue their trip. He went back and emptied the condo because he had to. I would think his parents paid for that because they didn't have enough money. So I must say, a very interesting comment from Gracie, and it kind of makes quite a lot of sense. Tommy says, thanks, Nick. You have been a calm voice in the storm. Enjoy your break. Thanks a lot, Tommy. So a couple of things to mention here. I don't know whether Gabby or Brian had to pay rent or had to pay for where they were staying, but one can imagine if they were living in his parents' condo and they weren't paying, that was a big help to them, and that was a big kind of an expense that they should have had, that they were saved thanks to the laundries, right? And that also, you could argue, allowed them to both save for the trip. Gracie says they had a small car they sold to get the van. Now, as I understand it, that was Gabby's Nissan. So I think you guys say Nissan. I don't know whether, I don't know, I've seen pictures of Gabby driving that vehicle, so I don't know if it was her vehicle, but I was under the impression it was her vehicle. But according to her, she says they had a small car, so perhaps they bought it together. They sold to get the van. So if they both owned that car and they sold it, then the van is sort of both of theirs. Perhaps Gabby paid a bit more. I get the impression the van was Gabby's. That doesn't seem to be in dispute. But it is interesting that Gracie says the van was previously owned by Brian's parents. It was used in their juice equipment business. He went back and emptied the condo because he had to. And this is perhaps the whole story about the container. I'm not 100% sure where she gets this information, but it sounds accurate. And then she says, I would think his parents paid for that. In other words, paid for the trip, the back, because they didn't have enough money. So that also makes sense. But it does also make you think, if they paid for the flight back, could they also have contributed to the van life journey, Brian's parents? Sunny Exposure says, so it was a condo, not a storage unit. I think it's both. I think if I understand correctly, and if this comment is true, then things were moved from the condo they stayed in to a storage unit or out of the storage unit. I'm not 100% sure. But this is my response to this comment. I don't understand why people think that Brian didn't contribute to the trip. That was her question. So I said, why would he steal money if he had his own money? And during the Moab incident, he mentioned saving money overnight by camping rather than staying at a hotel. It's also in their Instagram where they say they do downsize and live frugally. I think another possibility is if you say, why would he steal money if he had his own money? He may have felt that a lot of money was given to Gabby, or a lot of money. Gabby benefited in some way financially by staying with him or whatever. And so he may have felt that money was actually his, or that he deserved it. I've also mentioned in the Depop thing that some of the stuff that was sold was, what doesn't really make sense is you would think that Brian would have his own bank card. You would think that Brian would have his own money, that he wouldn't need to take someone else's bank card. And I don't know whether his cynicism against the world went so far that he didn't own a phone and he didn't have a bank and he didn't have all those things, but he used someone else's. He didn't have a car, but he would use someone else's. It just seems a bit odd that you would think that you would at least have your own bank account and you would at least have your own money. So I do think if you're trying to make the case that it was totally even financially, then Brian wouldn't have needed to take Gabby's money, if it was totally fair and even. Anyway, quite a good, interesting comment from Gracie Rose Miller. This has got to do with the Cleo Smith case. And I think this is quite interesting, where they said, the police said the parents are not suspects and there's no danger to the public. How on earth could they have said that if there was an abductor? Just think about that. There's no danger to the public, but quite weird, isn't it? I think that is it. Then I got this comment from someone, I'll just say, his name starts with a D. She said, I see no point of discussing conjectures instead of real evidence. Well, true crime does. The true crime community do see the point in that. And it's not instead of real evidence, it's taking what we know. It's taking things we know and thinking about those things and talking about those things. I think what is missing from a lot of true crime discussions is saying, where did you hear that? What is the source of that information? Did someone really say that? And I think another thing is looking at some of the things we believe and say, are we justified in believing that? Aren't we oversimplifying things? In other words, I think there is a point in discussing conjectures because it's a way of discerning reality and how good we are at that. When we were children, we played games at playing at reality. And as adults, we take real life dramas, real life events, and we conjecture about it as a way to understand the reality that we're actually in. I think that is the point of it. Someone also said, this was someone criticizing the channel, just saying, you touched on an important issue, the distress related to the financial situation, but you don't add any valuable information to this case. What is the financial situation of each of them? Was Gabby paying for everything? Both were working at a local supermarket, according to the news. Why did Brian withdraw money from Gabby's account? Was it out of need or just because she was no longer alive and he could take advantage? And so my response was, so in other words, why don't you add valuable information? What was the actual financial situation? Well, that's private information. You can't just get the financial records and publish them. It's just not. It's not only not legal. It's not. It's not ethical to publish someone else's private financial information, and you need permission to get it as well. And what I wrote here is, you apply an unreasonable standard if you expect me to know the financial situation intimately. No one does. In the Chris Watts case, one of the most important areas was his wife's true income from MLM. No one knows today what it actually was. So the financial narrative is important. The only way we're going to find out what it was in some way is by the parents telling us, the parents saying, you know what, they were really struggling. I tend to feel that we have a lot of information as it is. We already know from what they've said. We already know from their actions. We already know from their age. We already know from the expenses that they were going through. And it's clear that it was more of a business venture than a honeymoon. and the business venture was failing, which is perhaps why the honeymoon was as well. Endo says Nicole Atkinson didn't even made with Lavelle. Marcy says, I lived right by that hotel in Salt Lake City, Utah. That hotel was not cheap by any means. Okay. Oh, and then this is another really good comment by Cliff Notes. He's a patron on Patreon. He wrote, sorry, I've got to miss the live tomorrow, but can you share thoughts on perhaps Gabby Petito and Brian Laundrie unraveling? Was it in part to realizing that real life is vastly different than what they grew up on? Facebook and such are fantasy. I think they had no coping skills for real life and still were dependent children. So think about what they were actually trying to do. They were trying to go into the real world, but take into the real world this fantasy of it's so easy to make a living as a content creator. It's so easy to make a living as an influencer. And I think there was they were somewhat educated on that because they had traveled previously in the Nissan and they'd realized you can't Airbnb the whole way and you can't go to eat at restaurants and so on. So I think there was a certain amount of life experience, but I just think not enough. So to their credit, they had some insight into what they were about to get into, but I think they didn't realize how expensive it was going to be or how hard it was going to be. And I brought this up quite a few times. The van life thing, the way they imagined it, I think was a lot more like, what was that movie? Nomadland. The reality was that it would be quite grim, quite lonely, quite uncomfortable, quite, there would be anxious moments. It would be not that romantic. It would be filled with trials, and it would also have failure. If you think of Nomadland, the whole thing feels overshadowed by a sense of failure in a way, a sense of, and I don't mean that in a nasty way, just that she's lost everything and she somehow is just trying to find a way to keep going and survive. She's sort of existing and trying to make the most of it, but there's a bit of a sense of resignation about it. Whereas the story that we get from Brian and Gabby is this vivid, beautiful, everything is this adventure in this national park and that one. But the reality was that it was interspersed with arguing, lack of money, discomfort, stress, anxiety, the most important person sitting next to you not believing in what you're doing. And to some extent, there's at one point, I think 12 days where Gabby didn't post anything. And bear in mind, they got to the Grand Tetons and didn't post anything about that on social media. So I do think that the reality in terms of relationships, that reality was something that caught up to them. The reality in terms of money, the financial reality caught up to them. And I also think kind of a logistical reality caught up to them. And they were, for whatever reason, locked into going one way. And they didn't seem to see alternatives. And that's quite important. When you're a young person, things don't work out. You need to be able to give up or cash in your chips or turn falling into flying or just, you don't have to, I don't know, maybe the answer was that they should have stopped the social media, or that they should have just, probably what they needed to begin with was more money. They probably needed more money to finance what was going on. So probably in that time that where Gabby was in the hotel, she probably could have reached out to her parents. I don't know, found some way to solve the financial problem. Just said them done, definitely. Bridget Bowman says, I came to this very late today. What time is your live tomorrow? There's no live tomorrow, but there may be one on Saturday. There might be one on Saturday. Sunny Exposure says, this is such a strange case with so many unanswered questions. Susie, to anyone, somebody got police call log for home. Yeah, that's also quite an interesting aspect. Oh, Gracie Rose Miller's here. Good to have you here, Gracie. Her parents must have known about Moab because the police said, I will let you get back to your parents, but they said they didn't know about it. That is if, I mean, Gabby may have said, I'm phoning my parents. It doesn't mean that she did. Or maybe the guy assumed that she was. So I don't know. She may also have tried to contact her parents and they weren't available. So there are a couple of possibilities there. Endo says maybe Timmy will go live tomorrow. Timmy, I just heard him shaking. Timmy, you wanted here. Come. Come, boy. Come. People want to see you before you lose your fur coat, Timmy. People want to see you. Humphrey Ferguson says, how can you be a video YouTube creator on the road when you've never done it in your normal daily life? YouTube isn't TikTok. That's an excellent point, and I can tell you, when I went on my last trip in September, I don't like to think of myself as a YouTuber. I think I'm a bit more than that, but YouTube is a big part of what I do. But so when I went on this trip, I was thinking, how am I going to keep my subscribers sort of in the loop? And I found it difficult because I don't take my editing software with me when I go. And to be honest, I also didn't really want to be putting up videos every day because that's the point of it. It's a break. But I nevertheless felt that I need to, because it's a big part of my work, I need to, keep things going. And I found it quite difficult. I did put up a couple of shorts, and I did do a couple of lives when I was there, and some of them were quite terrible. The lighting, in one or two of them, the lighting was, Timmy, say goodbye. The lighting was just didn't work out. But I mean, I still did it anyway. And of course, if you haven't set all of that up, then it is very difficult to do that on the road. And as you say, that is what they ended up having to try and figure out and didn't figure out. Batman Justice, thanks for that. Is there a Batman and a Batman Justice? Juju Bean says, don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's see if we can get to 750 likes. So lots of prep is essential to make it work. Absolutely. It's not only getting it set up, but you've also got to be quite consistent. And I mean, they needed to have that channel monetized before they left. And, they ended up putting up one video. It's just very, very little content. So in terms of that, you sort of wonder what was going on that they just weren't thinking about that. And what I suspect in the case was that one of them, perhaps Brian, wanted it done so well. He wanted it so perfectly done and perfectly choreographed that they kept delaying it and postponing it. So, and that's one of the reasons that I took a long time to get into YouTube myself, was I wanted a certain kind of product, but I didn't know how to do it. And so I just didn't do it. And so wanting to do it to this standard meant that I just didn't do it. And it was only when someone actually started stealing my work, reading my blogs out, that I thought, wow, I suppose I could do that. In other words, I set a much lower standard or lower bar. But the important thing is that you need to start, you will learn how to be a better creator as time goes by. I've got to say, when I look at some of the new creators coming out, they are very good with their software. Of course, a lot of them have got designers that work with them, editors that work with them. I'm just I do everything. I do the research, I do the editing and everything. And I really could do with a bit of a crew to sort of, and so I can understand how Gabby could feel, because you do want someone to help you with it. Especially when you start from scratch, it seems pretty daunting, because some of the stuff you've got to learn how to do. When you don't know how to put up a video, when you've never put up a video, I'm not talking about a live video, I'm talking about an edited video. When you've never done that, it's not the easiest thing in the world. So, yeah, I think even just in terms of that, the social media, I think that they were a little bit naive. And they may have felt that they did enough in terms of setting up their Instagram. And I think maybe what they thought they were going to do is Instagram their way out of financial difficulty. They could get sponsored by clothing companies and apparel and whatnot. But then you really need tens of thousands of subscribers. Sunny Exposure says, have a great trip, Nick. When will you be back? I'll probably put up the odd live while I'm away, but I might be offline for a couple of days before that. Ando says, fantasizing about van life versus actual van life. I know when I went on this trip to the UK, I kind of fantasized about it. I thought of the UK as this sort of island paradise, and I couldn't wait to be in Leicester Square. And it just seemed like this amazing thing. And then when I was there, it was not quite at the level of fantasy that I had, definitely. When you're young, you want to escape the situation you're in, but be careful of having fantasies that are not very realistic, so you escape to something else. I just want to end off with questions, and then I'm going to go to Ernest Beck, and then I'll finish up. Stephanie actually made a good comment saying, quoting Mallet, I think a criminal psychologist or something like that, who said, Mallet believes the man who is being questioned is likely to be linked to Cleo and her family. And that's certainly being pondered, not, I think, by the mainstream media, but certainly by certain people. We always felt that this was something targeted. And so that actually came out of a news story that Stephanie highlighted. But what is quite interesting with that is that this person lives very close to, this is a different case, but someone who lives very close to the family where the child was abducted. I have a big question around that case, which is, how did the abductor know to go to the campsite to perform the abduction when they hadn't been there for a year? So just something to ponder. I'm not going to read that. Okay, so I'm done with that. Okay, and so the final thing I'm going to deal with is this question of Brian's silence. And it comes from the chapter Self-Esteem, chapter 7 from this book, The Birth and Death of Meaning. And it talks about Freud failed to explain satisfactory human motives. I really find this description interesting from Ernest Becker about silence. I think I've just made a mistake. It's actually from a different chapter. So it's actually from chapter 8, Culture and Personality, the Standardization of Self-Esteem. And he says, if there is any doubt that self-esteem is the dominant motive of man, there would be one sure way to dispel it. Okay, so we going to page 106, and he talks about silence here, and he says, he gives quite a few examples. The one is, he says, there was a man who spoke 6 languages, but didn't speak very much. So he was proficient in 6 languages, but spoke very seldom. And so there was the impression that this guy was a tremendous reservoir of meaningful potential. Quote, silence fascinates us because it implies that we carry something genuine around inside. Secrets and silence make life more real. The individual, self-absorbed and inwardly musing, taking himself very seriously, radiates a contagious aura. The tacit communication that the serious and meaningful exist. And this is the conviction without which we cannot live with proper dedication, end quote. What he's trying to say there, and now this has got a link to Brian Laundrie, is Brian was quite quiet, and you might assume quietness that that what is going on is very serious and very meaningful. And very genuine as well, right? You might think that when he's quiet, this is actually a person of real substance, but is it? So he goes on to say, this is at the bottom of page 106, and it's in a section titled Social Encounters, the Staging of Self-Esteem. And he says, quote, in our dealings with humans, silence conveys a conviction of meaning only because we infer that thought sequences are being entertained. So in other words, it's this impression that when someone is quiet or silent, they are actually thinking about something. Something is actually going on in that silence. But what if it's not? What if someone is quiet and there's nothing really going on in that silence, or nothing of sense? So on page 107, he says, quote, this is what captivates us incapable, self-assured people of few words. They give us living testimonial to the propriety of our symbolic designs. And so he talks about the strong silent type. Is the strong silent type really strong, or is he actually weak? And he refers to Howard Rowland, who talks about they have an appeal to many employees as well as to many of the most intelligent patients. One fact is that the catatonic has a great many secrets locked inside of him, and therefore is full of mystery in the midst of a world where very little is secret about anyone, right? And so there maybe have been this impression that Brian is more than that he actually is, that Brian is this gifted savant, or Brian is this thoughtful person. And he goes on to say, and I find this quite humorous, but also quite sad, because this has also happened to me. Not that someone thought this about me, or I hope not, but that I experienced this with someone else. This is page 107. He says, quote, with a charged commodity like silence, the most impaired persons can be skilled performers, exclamation mark. I remember during military service being intrigued by a young recruit from Alabama who never said more than a few words and who executed all the menial tasks of military life with a proper capability. It took me almost 3 years to discover that he did not possess any great depths, that made the average day seem not worthwhile communicating about. The reason he was always silent was simply that he had nothing to say. Women who have landed the strong silent hero of their school or college often discover the same thing many years later and to their chagrin. So what do you guys think about that? Was, being on the road with Brian, and Brian is not saying anything, he's just quiet. Well, Brian, what are you thinking about? Nothing. Drive, drive, drive. What are you thinking about? Nothing. What could that have felt like? He goes on to say on page 108, to say that they lack depth is simply to affirm that silence is part of a good performance, because it implies that a genuine self exists apart from and beyond the immediate encounter. And then he says the following: if I were to write a manual on seduction for adolescent young men, the first and foremost precept would be keep your mouth shut. What do you guys think of that? He says, if I were to write a manual on seduction for young adolescent men, keep your mouth shut. One thing we can conclude at this point, and it should be sobering, even unsettling, this is quoting from page 108, is that man's meaning hangs by a ludicrously fragile thread, such as a proper amount of silence. Now think about that, where you're traveling with someone, and what is for you the proper amount of silence? Now, for someone else, it's an amount. And for someone else, it's that amount. And someone wants to hear music so much, and someone wants to hear it not so much. And have you ever traveled with someone who has a different approach to silence? They want either a lot more silence than you do, or they want a lot less silence than you do. He goes on to say, the main thing that gives conviction to social performance is self-conviction on the part of the actor. Well, did Brian have that self-conviction? And if Brian was losing his confidence, also if Gabby was losing her confidence, if they were both losing their confidence, like imagine that you are engaged to someone, that person's engaged to you, and you're both losing your confidence. Can you imagine how stressful that is? It's like both of you have made a mistake in a way. Like both of you are losing your confidence, both of you are losing your conviction. It shows that almost everything you know about yourself and the world is wrong. Stephanie says, sometimes I talk too much. I think that applies to a couple of us. I don't know how much more I want to read here, but anyway, he says, the self, after all, is largely an attitude of self-regard inculcated into the child during his socialization. Don't let anyone bully you. Tell them, the strong self forces others to make an effort at performance that may often be beyond their means. And that might have been the case with Brian and Gabby, that Gabby may have been the strongest self, and she was trying to get Brian to act kind of like on social media. I think about Chris Watts and social media, just wasn't comfortable doing it. Now, yeah, they're on a social media business venture, and Brian doesn't want to participate, potentially. In Western films, this is page 110, in Western films, and just think about Yvonne Phillips says, Nick, at the risk of sounding sexist, there's a concept that quiet men are good lovers. Okay. I don't know if that's sexist, but it's interesting. In Western films, the self must above all be silent and self-sufficient. Think about the landscapes that Gabby and Brian went through. Not only silent and supposedly devoid of people, but also kind of the background, the backdrop of a lot of Westerns, right? So, page 110, he says, in Western forms, the self must above all be silent and self-sufficient, but capable of exploding into brutal murder while maintaining a disarming smile. The Western hero, in fact, provides the best proof that sustaining a convincing self is the basis for enhancing cultural meaning. With nothing but penetrating eyes, charged silence, and an IQ of 80, why does this character thrill audiences to the core? The Western hero conveys little more but nothing less than unshakable conviction that underneath it all there's a genuine meaning in man's action. And what if that is what Brian felt, that while they were out there, it didn't feel meaningful to him? And think about his attitude to culture and society. And wow, we're making money through this. Well, that's not meaningful. I don't want to do that, right? He also says, we may fear the bully and may admire physical strength, but unless the bully also broods, and unless the strength serves a symbolic design, we will not sit in its shadow. I think things have changed since this book was written. The Clint Eastwood type hero isn't quite the same anymore. We've got James Bond in a way who's more communicative. Even John Wick is kind of more of an expressive character. So the very last paragraph in this chapter, he says, what happens if by his performance he undermines the precariously constituted cultural meaning from which everyone draws the vital sustenance of motivation and value? This is the critical characteristic of those we term abnormal and presents a major problem in the study of society. So what he's saying essentially is this strong silent type. What if he's actually undermining the cultural meaning? And think about them going into these centers of cultural meaning, these national parks. Think about them going into these campsites and sort of saying, we don't want to have anything to do with you guys, and going into a restaurant and not being very happy there. Well, it's actually undermining I won't say the world, but undermining their countrymen. And so in a situation like that, where you've already got this sense of anti-socialness going on, and your partner then realizes, well, I think you're part of that society that I don't agree with. Your partner becomes, you are part of what is wrong with this country or whatever, right? And suddenly you're with an antisocial person, someone who's anti-society, and you've been with that person, but only now to be exposed as you're the enemy and you're my enemy. Could that not also have happened? That Brian's political and philosophical attitudes in his quietness brought into a certain place where he felt that Gabby was undermining him, or undermining him as a person, undermining him as a fiancé, but also undermining his philosophy of whatever, people are an infestation or whatever. What do you think about that? And so if that is true, you might get some kind of memo or manifesto in his notebook talking about that, talking about what is wrong with us, what is wrong with society. His gripe against society which may have overflowed onto Gabby. And like, how could you betray me? You are just like everyone else. I thought we agreed on this. I thought we were in it together, us against the world, but you are just as blah, 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 blah. And you can imagine if you're a young person like that and you're in love with someone and you're fatally betrayed in that sense, it may not be true, just what you imagine is true, what you perceive to be true, then you can imagine someone getting that, that quiet person boiling over. Does that make sense? Batman says boring is nice. Okay. Anna says love your accent. Okay, well, this accent's about to sign off. Suppose I can take a few more comments. Patricia says antisocial people are so dull. Okay. Pauline says I think that's very possible. Leanne Edwards. Catherine says traveling alone is very fulfilling. I've traveled a lot alone. I've been fulfilled. If I had to choose, I think I'd rather travel at least with my dog. I'd rather not travel. I've done a lot of traveling by myself. I could definitely do with some traveling with someone. Adora says some people have no personality at all. What if your entire personality is for social media and then what's left, there's nothing? It's like, I'm going to act and perform and put on a brave face and smile and for social media, but back home I'm going to just be warts and all. What does that feel like? Janelle says, yes, agree, great live. Big Lock Joker says, what is the similarity between the campsite at Arches and Grand Teton? What is the similarity? They were both outdoors. There were rocks around. It's sort of mountainous terrain, I guess. Snowline says, I love traveling alone. Carla says, I'm Watson all the time. Good for you. Thought criminal here? I've actually seen you, because your font is different, I have actually seen you a few times already. What about a monk contemplating? Annie Rose, his biggest tragedy is he couldn't accept that she didn't love him and walk away. Stephanie says, you're a marathon man tonight. Thank you for a thoughtful discussion. Yeah, I think this has been one of the longest discussions and I haven't even finished my water, so definitely has gone quite well. I actually thought this discussion was going to be totally overrun by the Cleo Smith case, and I must say I'm relieved it hasn't been. Quite a lot happening there. If you're not familiar with the case, little girl was abducted, 3 weeks past, the abductor has been caught under a little bit mysterious circumstances, and people are wondering how he was monitoring the family. Was he following them on Facebook? What was actually going on? Sharon says, I'm a homebody, so don't understand the whole traveling thing. Thanks, Sharon. Sonia says, lots of us are going to miss when the break of this channel comes. I will try and put up shorts. So I'll try and put up a couple of shorts, and that'll be in the loop here and there. So don't worry about that. Sunset says, thank you, TCRS, for your time and effort. Jean says, not many things I can do 3 hours straight, but listen to your thoughts. Okay. Anyway, I hope that has been useful. Remember, I started this live talking about the dog and the cat looking out there, and it ended up being this big bird that was totally unexpected. Most of the time we see what we expect to see, and that's why what we expect to see is what we see. But there are times in true crime where we're surprised, and I think we've got to remember that life isn't without surprises. We don't know everything, and I think this case where Brian actually disappeared and no one could find him, and we still don't actually know what happened, is confirmation that we don't know everything, and it's kind of okay. It's okay not to know everything. It's a mistake to think we know everything, and it's a mistake Brian and Gabby made. It's a mistake they made where they thought that they knew what they were in for. And so it's quite important that we are humble enough to realize that no matter what our age is, and no matter how clever we are, somewhere or other life is going to surprise you. I put up a clip on Twitter where someone was filming a bush pig, and quite a big bush pig, and you can hear the guy saying, "Oh, it's quite a cute pig, and I wonder if I can touch it." And the next thing, when the pig is right by him, it attacks him and with a snort. And bush pigs can hurt you. They've got tusks and so on. I'm not sure what bush pigs against wild boars. I don't know who would win that contest. But that guy was totally surprised. And at the end of that, you actually hear him saying, "Please help." So it makes sense no matter what age you are. What we can learn from the Gabby Petito case is sometimes we don't know as much as we think we do. And also life can be surprising. Think about that with regard to climate change, where a lot of us have thought we know what to expect with climate change for decades, and look where we are now. And how do we feel now? Do we still think we know what's going to happen? Also with the pandemic, a lot of us have thought we know what's going on, and things have surprised us. Be prepared to be surprised, expect the unexpected, and you are on a closer track to reality than if you're pretty sure you know what is going on. That's certainly a lesson I've learned in the last couple of cases, and I hope it's something that you can take with you. Just is that humility where you can say, it's not important that I know everything and that I'm right. What's important is that I'm curious and that I'm open to what I can see around me, and that I can see reality for what it is, not for what I'm expecting it to be. And I'm open to being surprised. I'm open to, it's like almost like saying, life surprised me. And you will be, because life is by its very nature changing and surprising. So I'm hoping on my trip I'm going to have some surprising encounters. Sometimes they're not pleasant, but it is life. A flat tire is part of life. The one thing about it is not guaranteed. One of my best friends has lost his life recently, and it's one of the reasons why I feel it's so important to go on this trip is your life isn't guaranteed. Your health isn't even guaranteed. Susan says, the more I learn, the less I know. Paul T says, there is no reality. As she says, life is an adventure. Have adventures every day. Stephanie's put up a link to Patreon. If you like this community, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Thought Criminal says, enjoy your break and please do not have Timmy's brows trimmed. I'll try and make sure that doesn't happen. Sonia says, it was the artwork which brought me here to begin with. By the way, if you guys are interested in Van Gogh, there is a playlist with episodes on Van Gogh, and a lot of people who've watched it have really enjoyed it. Molly says, I really like your philosophy. Lou says, well, Lou, I think you're from South Africa. You're up quite late. It's almost 3 o'clock in the morning. Enjoy your trip. Take care. Avoid big birds. Yeah. Okay, so I might be doing another live on Saturday, and then look out for a couple of shorts on this channel. Thanks everyone for being here. Thanks for the super chats. Thank you for the mods that are here. Yvonne Phillips, thanks for being here. There are no flats this time. Mods, thank you all for being here, and thank you all for your questions. Some of you asked some really good questions, and it always is good to sort of take them seriously, even when they're hard to answer. Thanks, Jedi Bunny. Nana, take care. Stephanie, thanks a lot for being here. Snow Lion says Nick's coverage of Van Gogh is excellent. I really have enjoyed it. So bear in mind, I wrote a book about Van Gogh, but also you can go through the playlist on this channel. So check that out. Thanks to everyone, and take care, and I'll see you guys next time. Ciao.